Section 19 of Library of World's Best Mystery and Detective Stories, Volume 4. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Darvinia. Library of the World's Best Mystery and Detective Stories, Volume 4 by Julian Hawthorne, Editor. Section 19. Zadig the Babylonian by Voltaire. Part 2. The Disputes and the Audiences. In this manner he daily discovered the subtlety of his genius and the goodness of his heart. The people at once admired and loved him. He passed for the happiest man in the world. The whole empire resounded with his name. All the ladies ogled him. All the men praised him for his justice. The learned regarded him as an oracle, and even the priests confessed that he knew more than the old arch-magi, Yebor. They were now so far from prosecuting him on account of the griffin, that they believed nothing but what he thought credible. There had reigned in Babylon, for the space of 1500 years, a violent contest that had divided the empire into two sects. The one pretended that they ought to enter the temple of Mitra with the left foot foremost. The other held this custom in detestation, and always entered with the right foot first. The people waited with great impatience for the day on which the solemn feast of the sacred fire was to be celebrated, to see which sect Zadig would favor. All the world had their eyes fixed on his 2 feet, and the whole city was in the utmost suspense and perturbation. Zadig jumped into the temple with his feet joined together, and afterwards proved, in an eloquent discourse, that the sovereign of heaven and earth, who accepted not the persons of men, makes no distinction between the right and left foot. The envious man and his wife alleged that his discourse was not figurative enough, and that he did not make the rocks and mountains to dance with sufficient agility. "He is dry," said they, "and void of genius. He does not make the flea to fly and stars to fall, nor the sun to melt wax. He has not the true Oriental style." Zadig contented himself with having the style of reason. All the world favored him, not because he was in the right road, or followed the dictates of reason, or was a man of real merit, but because he was prime vizier. He terminated with the same happy address the grand difference between the white and the black magi. The former maintained that it was the height of impiety to pray to God with the face turned toward the east in winter. The latter asserted that God abhorred the prayers of those who turned toward the west in summer. Zadig decreed that every man should be allowed to turn as he pleased. Thus he found out the happy secret of finishing all affairs, whether of a private or public nature, in the morning. The rest of the day he employed in superintending and promoting the embellishments of Babylon. He exhibited tragedies that drew tears from the eyes of the spectators, and comedies that shook their sides with laughter; a custom which had long been disused, and which his good taste now induced him to revive. He never affected to be more knowing in the polite arts than the artists themselves. He encouraged them by rewards and honors, and was never jealous of their talents. In the evening the king was highly entertained with his conversation, and the queen still more. "Great minister," said the king. "Amiable minister," said the queen; and both of them added, "It would have been a great loss to the state had such a man been hanged." Never was man in power obliged to give so many audiences to the ladies. Most of them came to consult him about no business at all, that so they might have some business with him; but none of them won his attention. Meanwhile Zadig perceived that his thoughts were always distracted, as well when he gave audience as when he sat in judgment. He did not know to what to attribute this absence of mind, and that was his only sorrow. He had a dream in which he imagined that he laid himself down upon a heap of dry herbs, among which there were many prickly ones that gave him great uneasiness, and that he afterwards reposed himself on a soft bed of roses, from which there sprung a serpent that wounded him to the heart with its sharp and venomed tongue. "Alas!" said he, "I have long lain on these dry and prickly herbs. I am now on the bed of roses. But what shall be the serpent?" Jealousy. Zadig's calamities sprung even from his happiness, and especially from his merit. He every day conversed with the king and Astarte, his august comfort. The charms of his conversation were greatly heightened by that desire of pleasing, which is to the mind what dress is to beauty. His youth and graceful appearance insensibly made an impression on Astarte, which she did not at first perceive. Her passion grew and flourished in the bosom of innocence. Without fear or scruple, she indulged the pleasing satisfaction of seeing and hearing a man who was so dear to her husband and to the empire in general. She was continually praising him to the king. She talked of him to her women, who were always sure to improve on her praises. And thus everything contributed to pierce her heart with a dart, of which she did not seem to be sensible. She made several presents to Zadig, which discovered a greater spirit of gallantry than she imagined. She intended to speak to him only as a queen satisfied with his services, and her expressions were sometimes those of a woman in love. Astarte was much more beautiful than that Semira who had such a strong aversion to one-eyed men, or that other woman who had resolved to cut off her husband's nose. Her unreserved familiarity, her tender expressions, at which she began to blush, and her eyes, which, though she endeavored to divert them to other objects, were always fixed upon his, inspired Zadig with a passion that filled him with astonishment. He struggled hard to get the better of it. He called to his aid the precepts of philosophy, which had always stood him in stead. But from thence, though he could derive the light of knowledge, he could procure no remedy to cure the disorders of his lovesick heart. Duty, gratitude, and violated majesty presented themselves to his mind as so many avenging gods. He struggled, he conquered. But this victory, which he was obliged to purchase afresh every moment, cost him many sighs and tears. He no longer dared to speak to the queen with that sweet and charming familiarity which had been so agreeable to them both. His countenance was covered with a cloud. His conversation was constrained and incoherent. His eyes were fixed on the ground, and when, in spite of all his endeavors to the contrary, they encountered those of the queen, they found them bathed in tears and darting arrows of flame. They seemed to say, "We adore each other, and yet are afraid to love. We both burn with a fire which we both condemn." Zadig left the royal presence full of perplexity and despair, and having his heart oppressed with a burden which he was no longer able to bear. In the violence of his perturbation, he involuntarily betrayed the secret to his friend Cador, in the same manner as a man who, having long supported the fits of a cruel disease, discovered his pain by a cry extorted from him by a more severe fit, and by the cold sweat that covers his brow. "I have already discovered," said Cador, "the sentiments which thou wouldst fain conceal from thyself. The symptoms by which the passions show themselves are certain and infallible. Judge, my dear Zadig, since I have read thy heart, whether the king will not discover something in it that may give him offence. He has no other fault but that of being the most jealous man in the world. Thou canst resist the violence of thy passion with greater fortitude than the queen, because thou art a philosopher, and because thou art Zadig. Astarte is a woman. She suffers her eyes to speak with so much the more imprudence, as she does not as yet think herself guilty. Conscious of her innocence, she unhappily neglects those external appearances which are so necessary. I shall tremble for her so long as she has nothing wherewithal to reproach herself. Were ye both of one mind, ye might easily deceive the whole world. A growing passion, which we endeavour to suppress, discovers itself, in spite of all our efforts to the contrary. But love, when gratified, is easily concealed. Zadig trembled at the proposal of betraying the king, his benefactor, and never was he more faithful to his prince than when guilty of an involuntary crime against him. Meanwhile the queen mentioned the name of Zadig so frequently, and with such a blushing and downcast look. She was sometimes so lively, and sometimes so perplexed when she spoke to him in the king's presence, and was seized with such deep thoughtfulness at his going away, that the king began to be troubled. He believed all that he saw, and imagined all that he did not see. He particularly remarked that his wife's shoes were blue, and that Zadig's shoes were blue; that his wife's ribbons were yellow, and that Zadig's bonnet was yellow; and these were terrible symptoms to a prince of so much delicacy. In his jealous mind suspicions were turned into certainty. All the slaves of kings and queens are so many spies over their hearts. They soon observed that Astarte was tender, and that Moabdar was jealous. The envious man brought false reports to the king. The monarch now thought of nothing but in what manner he might best execute his vengeance. He one night resolved to poison the queen, and in the morning to put Zadig to death by the bowstring. The orders were given to a merciless eunuch, who commonly executed his acts of vengeance. There happened at that time to be in the king's chamber a little dwarf, who, though dumb, was not deaf. He was allowed, on account of his insignificance, to go wherever he pleased, and, as a domestic animal, was a witness of what passed in the most profound secrecy. This little mute was strongly attached to the queen and Zadig. With equal horror and surprise he heard the cruel orders given. But how to prevent the fatal sentence that in a few hours was to be carried into execution? He could not write, but he could paint, and excelled particularly in drawing a striking resemblance. He employed a part of the night in sketching out with his pencil what he meant to impart to the queen. The piece represented the king in one corner, boiling with rage, and giving orders to the eunuch; a bowstring and a bowl on a table; the queen in the middle of the picture, expiring in the arms of her woman, and Zadig strangled at her feet. The horizon represented a rising sun, to express that this shocking execution was to be performed in the morning. As soon as he had finished the picture, he ran to one of Astarte's women, awakened her, and made her understand that she must immediately carry it to the queen. At midnight a messenger knocks at Zadig's door, awakes him, and gives him a note from the queen. He doubts whether it is a dream, and opens the letter with a trembling hand. But how great was his surprise! And who can express the consternation and despair into which he was thrown upon reading these words: "Fly this instant, or thou art a dead man. Fly, Zadig, I conjure thee by our mutual love and my yellow ribbons. I have not been guilty, but I find I must die like a criminal." Zadig was hardly able to speak. He sent for Cador, and without uttering a word, gave him the note. Cador forced him to obey, and forthwith to take the road to Memphis. "Shouldst thou dare," said he, "to go in search of the queen, thou wilt hasten her death. Shouldst thou speak to the king, thou wilt infallibly ruin her. I will take upon me the charge of her destiny. Follow thy own. I will spread a report that thou hast taken the road to India. I will soon follow thee, and inform thee of all that shall have passed in Babylon." At that instant Cador caused two of the swiftest dromedaries to be brought to a private gate of the palace. Upon one of these he mounted Zadig, whom he was obliged to carry to the door, and who was ready to expire with grief. He was accompanied by a single domestic, and Cador, plunged in sorrow and astonishment, soon lost sight of his friend. This illustrious fugitive, arriving on the side of a hill, from whence he could take a view of Babylon, turned his eyes toward the queen's palace, and fainted away at the sight; nor did he recover his senses, but to shed a torrent of tears, and to wish for death. At length, after his thoughts had been long engrossed in lamenting the unhappy fate of the loveliest woman and the greatest queen in the world, he for a moment turned his views on himself, and cried, "What then is human life? O Virtue, how hast thou served me? 2 women have basely deceived me, and now a third, who is innocent and more beautiful than both the others, is going to be put to death. Whatever good I have done hath been to me a continual source of calamity and affliction, and I have only been raised to the height of grandeur, to be tumbled down the most horrid precipice of misfortune." Filled with these gloomy reflections, his eyes overspread with the veil of grief, his countenance covered with the paleness of death, and his soul plunged in an abyss of the blackest despair, he continued his journey toward Egypt. The Woman Beaten. Zadig directed his course by the stars. The constellation of Orion and the splendid Dog Star guided his steps toward the pole of Cassiopeia. He admired those vast globes of light, which appear to our eyes but as so many little sparks, while the earth, which in reality is only an imperceptible point in nature, appears to our fond imaginations as something so grand and noble. He then represented to himself the human species as it really is, as a parcel of insects devouring one another on a little atom of clay. This true image seemed to annihilate his misfortunes, by making him sensible of the nothingness of his own being, and of that of Babylon. His soul launched out into infinity, and detached from the senses, contemplated the immutable order of the universe. But when afterwards, returning to himself, and entering into his own heart, he considered that Astarte had perhaps died for him, the universe vanished from his sight, and he beheld nothing in the whole compass of nature but Astarte expiring, and Zadig unhappy. While he thus alternately gave up his mind to this flux and reflux of sublime philosophy and intolerable grief, he advanced toward the frontiers of Egypt, and his faithful domestic was already in the first village, in search of a lodging. Upon reaching the village, Zadig generously took the part of a woman attacked by her jealous lover. The combat grew so fierce that Zadig slew the lover. The Egyptians were then just and humane. The people conducted Zadig to the town house. They first of all ordered his wound to be dressed, and then examined him and his servant apart, in order to discover the truth. They found that Zadig was not an assassin, but, as he was guilty of having killed a man, the law condemned him to be a slave. His 2 camels were sold for the benefit of the town. All the gold he had brought with him was distributed among the inhabitants, and his person, as well as that of the companion of his journey, was exposed to sale in the market place. An Arabian merchant, named Setoc, made the purchase, but as the servant was fitter for labour than the master, he was sold at a higher price. There was no comparison between the two men. Thus Zadig became a slave subordinate to his own servant. They were linked together by a chain fastened to their feet, and in this condition they followed the Arabian merchant to his house. By the way, Zadig comforted his servant and exhorted him to patience, but he could not help making, according to his usual custom, some reflections on human life. "I see," said he, "that the unhappiness of my fate hath an influence on thine. Hitherto everything has turned out to me in a most unaccountable manner. I have been condemned to pay a fine for having seen the marks of a spaniel's feet. I thought that I should once have been impaled on account of a griffin. I have been sent to execution for having made some verses in praise of the king. I have been upon the point of being strangled because the queen had yellow ribbons. And now I am a slave with thee, because a brutal wretch beat his mistress. Come, let us keep a good heart. All this perhaps will have an end. The Arabian merchants must necessarily have slaves, and why not me as well as another, since, as well as another, I am a man? This merchant will not be cruel. He must treat his slaves well, if he expects any advantage from them." But while he spoke thus, his heart was entirely engrossed by the fate of the Queen of Babylon. 2 days after, the merchant Setoc set out for Arabia Deserta, with his slaves and his camels. His tribe dwelt near the desert of Oreb. The journey was long and painful. Setoc set a much greater value on the servant than the master, because the former was more expert in loading the camels, and all the little marks of distinction were shown to him. A camel having died within 2 days' journey of Oreb, his burden was divided and laid on the backs of the servants, and Zadig had his share among the rest. Setoc laughed to see all his slaves walking with their bodies inclined. Zadig took the liberty to explain to him the cause, and inform him of the laws of the balance. The merchant was astonished, and began to regard him with other eyes. Zadig, finding he had raised his curiosity, increased it still further by acquainting him with many things that related to commerce, the specific gravity of metals, and commodities under an equal bulk, the properties of several useful animals, and the means of rendering those useful that are not naturally so. At last Setoc began to consider Zadig as a sage, and preferred him to his companion, whom he had formerly so much esteemed. He treated him well, and had no cause to repent of his kindness. The Stone. As soon as Setoc arrived among his own tribe, he demanded the payment of 500 ounces of silver, which he had lent to a Jew in presence of 2 witnesses. But as the witnesses were dead, and the debt could not be proved, the Hebrew appropriated the merchant's money to himself, and piously thanked God for putting it in his power to cheat an Arabian. Setoc imparted this troublesome affair to Zadig, who was now become his counsel. "In what place," said Zadig, "didst thou lend the 500 ounces to this infidel?" "Upon a large stone," replied the merchant, "that lies near Mount Oreb." "What is the character of thy debtor?" said Zadig. "That of a knave," returned Setoc. "But I ask thee whether he is lively or phlegmatic, cautious or imprudent?" "He is, of all bad payers," said Setoc, "the most lively fellow I ever knew." "Well," resumed Zadig, "allow me to plead thy cause." In effect, Zadig, having summoned the Jew to the tribunal, addressed the judge in the following terms: pillow of the throne of equity, I come to demand of this man, in the name of my master, 500 ounces of silver, which he refuses to pay." "Hast thou any witnesses?" said the judge. "No, they are dead, but there remains a large stone upon which the money was counted, and if it please thy grandeur to order the stone to be sought for, I hope that it will bear witness. The Hebrew and I will tarry here till the stone arrives. I will send for it at my master's expense." "With all my heart," replied the judge, and immediately applied himself to the discussion of other affairs. When the court was going to break up, the judge said to Zadig, "Well, friend, is not thy stone come yet?" The Hebrew replied with a smile, "Thy grandeur may stay here till the morrow, and after all not see the stone. It is more than 6 miles from hence, and it would require 15 men to move it." "Well," cried Zadig, "did not I say that the stone would bear witness? Since this man knows where it is, he thereby confesses that it was upon it that the money was counted." The Hebrew was disconcerted, and was soon after obliged to confess the truth. The judge ordered him to be fastened to the stone, without meat or drink, till he should restore the 500 ounces, which were soon after paid. The slave Zadig and the stone were held in great repute in Arabia. The funeral pile. Setoc, charmed with the happy issue of this affair, made his slave his intimate friend. He had now conceived as great esteem for him as ever the king of Babylon had done, and Zadig was glad that Setoc had no wife. He discovered in his master a good natural disposition, much probity of heart, and a great share of good sense. But he was sorry to see that, according to the ancient custom of Arabia, he adored the host of heaven, that is, the sun, moon, and stars. He sometimes spoke to him on this subject with great prudence and discretion. At last he told him that these bodies were like all other bodies in the universe, and no more deserving of our homage than a tree or a rock. "But," said Setoc, "they are eternal beings, and it is from them we derive all we enjoy. They animate nature, they regulate the seasons, and besides are removed at such an immense distance from us that we cannot help revering them." "Thou receivest more advantage," replied Zadig, "from the waters of the Red Sea, which carry thy merchandise to the Indies. Why may not it be as ancient as the stars? And if thou adorest what is placed at a distance from thee, thou oughtest to adore the land of the Gangarides, which lies at the extremity of the earth." "No," said Setoc, "the brightness of the stars command my adoration." At night Zadig lighted up a great number of candles in the tent where he was to sup with Setoc, and the moment his patron appeared, he fell on his knees before these lighted tapers, and said, "Eternal and shining luminaries, be ye always propitious to me." Having thus said, he sat down at table, without taking the least notice of Setoc. "What art thou doing?" said Setoc to him in amaze. "I act like thee," replied Zadig. "I adore these candles, and neglect their master and mine." Setoc comprehended the profound sense of this apologue. The wisdom of his slave sunk deep into his soul. He no longer offered incense to the creatures, but adored the eternal Being who made them. There prevailed at that time in Arabia a shocking custom, sprung originally from Scythia, and which, being established in the Indies by the credit of the Brahmans, threatened to overrun all the East. When a married man died, and his beloved wife aspired to the character of a saint, she burned herself publicly on the body of her husband. This was a solemn feast, and was called the funeral pile of widowhood, and that tribe in which most women had been burned was the most respected. An Arabian of Setoc's tribe being dead, his widow, whose name was Almona, and who was very devout, published the day and hour when she intended to throw herself into the fire amidst the sound of drums and trumpets. Zadig remonstrated against this horrible custom. He showed Setoc how inconsistent it was with the happiness of mankind to suffer young widows to burn themselves every other day, widows who were capable of giving children to the state, or at least of educating those they already had. And he convinced him that it was his duty to do all that lay in his power to abolish such a barbarous practice. "The women," said Setoc, "have possessed the right of burning themselves for more than 1,000 years, and who shall dare to abrogate a law which time hath rendered sacred? Is there anything more respectable than ancient abuses?" "Reason is more ancient," replied Zadig. "Meanwhile speak thou to the chiefs of the tribes, and I will go to wait on the young widow." Accordingly he was introduced to her, and after having insinuated himself into her good graces by some compliments on her beauty, and told her what a pity it was to commit so many charms to the flames, he at last praised her for her constancy and courage. "Thou must surely have loved thy husband," said he to her, "with the most passionate fondness." "Who, I?" replied the lady. "I loved him not at all. He was a brutal, jealous, insupportable wretch. But I am firmly resolved to throw myself on his funeral pile." "It would appear then," said Zadig, "that there must be a very delicious pleasure in being burned alive." "Oh, it makes nature shudder," replied the lady; "but that must be overlooked. I am a devotee, and I should lose my reputation, and all the world would despise me, if I did not burn myself." Zadig, having made her acknowledge that she burned herself to gain the good opinion of others, and to gratify her own vanity, entertained her with a long discourse, calculated to make her a little in love with life, and even went so far as to inspire her with some degree of goodwill for the person who spoke to her. "Alas!" said the lady, "I believe I should desire thee to marry me." Zadig's mind was too much engrossed with the idea of Astarte not to elude this declaration, but he instantly went to the chiefs of the tribes, told them what had passed, and advised them to make a law by which a widow should not be permitted to burn herself till she had conversed privately with a young man for the space of an hour. Since that time not a single woman hath burned herself in Arabia. They were indebted to Zadig alone for destroying in one day a cruel custom that had lasted for so many ages, and thus he became the benefactor of Arabia. The supper. Setoc, who could not separate himself from this man, in whom dwelt wisdom, carried him to the great fair of Balzora, whither the richest merchants in the earth resorted. Zadig was highly pleased to see so many men of different countries united in the same place. He considered the whole universe as one large family assembled at Balzora. Setoc, after having sold his commodities at a very high price, returned to his own tribe with his friend Zadig, who learned, upon his arrival, that he had been tried in his absence, and was now going to be burned by a slow fire. Only the friendship of Almona saved his life. Like so many pretty women, she possessed great influence with the priesthood. Zadig thought it best to leave Arabia. Setoc was so charmed with the ingenuity and address of Almona that he made her his wife. Zadig departed, after having thrown himself at the feet of his fair deliverer. Setoc and he took leave of each other with tears in their eyes, swearing an eternal friendship, and promising that the first of them that should acquire a large fortune should share it with the other. Zadig directed his course along the frontiers of Assyria, still musing on the unhappy Astarte, and reflecting on the severity of fortune, which seemed determined to make him the sport of her cruelty and the object of her persecution. "What," said he to himself, 400 ounces of gold for having seen a spaniel, condemned to lose my head for 4 bad verses in praise of the king, ready to be strangled because the queen had ribbons of the colour of my bonnet, reduced to slavery for having succoured a woman who was beat, and on the point of being burned for having saved the lives of all the young widows of Arabia." The Robber. Arriving on the frontiers which divide Arabia Petraea from Syria, he passed by a pretty strong castle, from which a party of armed Arabians sallied forth. They instantly surrounded him, and cried, "All thou hast belongs to us, and thy person is the property of our master." Zadig replied by drawing his sword. His servant, who was a man of courage, did the same. They killed the first Arabians that presumed to lay hands on them; and though the number was redoubled, they were not dismayed, but resolved to perish in the conflict. 2 men defended themselves against a multitude, and such a combat could not last long. The master of the castle, whose name was Arbogad, having observed from a window the prodigies of valor performed by Zadig, conceived a high esteem for this heroic stranger. He descended in haste, and went in person to call off his men and deliver the 2 travelers. "All that passes over my lands," said he, "belongs to me, as well as what I find upon the lands of others. But thou seemest to be a man of such undaunted courage that I will exempt thee from the common law." He then conducted him to his castle, ordering his men to treat him well; and in the evening Arbogad supped with Zadig. The lord of the castle was one of those Arabians who are commonly called robbers; but he now and then performed some good actions amid a multitude of bad ones. He robbed with a furious rapacity, and granted favors with great generosity. He was intrepid in action, affable in company, a debauchee at table, but gay in debauchery, and particularly remarkable for his frank and open behaviour. He was highly pleased with Zadig, whose lively conversation lengthened the repast. At last Arbogad said to him, "I advise thee to enrol thy name in my catalogue. Thou canst not do better. This is not a bad trade, and thou mayest one day become what I am at present." "May I take the liberty of asking thee," said Zadig, "how long thou hast followed this noble profession?" "From my most tender youth," replied the lord. "I was a servant to a pretty good-natured Arabian, but could not endure the hardships of my situation. I was vexed to find that fate had given me no share of the earth, which equally belongs to all men. I imparted the cause of my uneasiness to an old Arabian, who said to me, 'My son, do not despair. There was once a grain of sand that lamented that it was no more than a neglected atom in the deserts. At the end of a few years it became a diamond, and is now the brightest ornament in the crown of the King of the Indies.' This discourse made a deep impression on my mind. I was the grain of sand, and I resolved to become the diamond. I began by stealing 2 horses. I soon got a party of companions. I put myself in a condition to rob small caravans, and thus by degrees I destroyed the difference which had formerly subsisted between me and other men. I had my share of the good things of this world, and was even recompensed with usury for the hardships I had suffered. I was greatly respected, and became the captain of a band of robbers. I seized this castle by force. The satrap of Syria had a mind to dispossess me of it, but I was too rich to have anything to fear. I gave the satrap a handsome present, by which means I preserved my castle and increased my possessions. He even appointed me treasurer of the tributes which Arabia Petraea pays to the King of Kings. I perform my office of receiver with great punctuality, but take the freedom to dispense with that of paymaster. The Grand Desterham of Babylon sent hither a pretty satrap in the name of King Moabdar to have me strangled. This man arrived with his orders. I was apprised of all. I caused to be strangled in his presence the 4 persons he had brought with him to draw the noose. After which I asked him how much his commission of strangling me might be worth. He replied that his fees would amount to above 300 pieces of gold. I then convinced him that he might gain more by staying with me. I made him an inferior robber, and he is now one of my best and richest officers. If thou wilt take my advice, thy success may be equal to his. Never was there a better season for plunder, since King Moabdar is killed, and all Babylon thrown into confusion." "Moabdar killed?" said Zadig. "And what is become of Queen Astarte?" "I know not," replied Arbogad. "All I know is, that Moabdar lost his senses and was killed; that Babylon is a scene of disorder and bloodshed; that all the empire is desolated; that there are some fine strokes to be struck yet; and that, for my own part, I have struck some that are admirable." "But the queen," said Zadig, "for heaven's sake, knowest thou nothing of the queen's fate?" "Yes," replied he, "I have heard something of a prince of Hyrcania. If she was not killed in the tumult, she is probably one of his concubines. But I am much fonder of booty than news. I have taken several women in my excursions, but I keep none of them. I sell them at a high price when they are beautiful, without inquiring who they are. In commodities of this kind rank makes no difference, and a queen that is ugly will never find a merchant. Perhaps I may have sold Queen Astarte; perhaps she is dead. But be it as it will, it is of little consequence to me, and I should imagine of as little to thee." So saying, he drank a large draught, which threw all his ideas into such confusion that Zadig could obtain no further information. Zadig remained for some time without speech, sense, or motion. Arbogad continued drinking, told stories, constantly repeated that he was the happiest man in the world, and exhorted Zadig to put himself in the same condition. At last the soporiferous fumes of the wine lulled him into a gentle repose. Zadig passed the night in the most violent perturbation. "What," said he, "did the king lose his senses? And is he killed? I cannot help lamenting his fate. The empire is rent in pieces, and this robber is happy. O fortune! O destiny! A robber is happy, and the most beautiful of nature's works hath perhaps perished in a barbarous manner, or lives in a state worse than death. O Astarte! What is become of thee?" At daybreak he questioned all those he met in the castle, but they were all busy, and he received no answer. During the night they had made a new capture, and they were now employed in dividing the spoils. All he could obtain in this hurry and confusion was an opportunity of departing, which he immediately embraced, plunged deeper than ever in the most gloomy and mournful reflections. Zadig proceeded on his journey with a mind full of disquiet and perplexity, and wholly employed on the unhappy Astarte, on the king of Babylon, on his faithful friend Cador, on the happy robber Arbogad, in a word, on all the misfortunes and disappointments he had hitherto suffered. The Fisherman. At a few leagues' distance from Arbogad's castle he came to the banks of a small river, still deploring his fate, and considering himself as the most wretched of mankind. He saw a fisherman lying on the brink of the river, scarcely holding, in his weak and feeble hand, a net which he seemed ready to drop, and lifting up his eyes to heaven. "I am certainly," said the fisherman, "the most unhappy man in the world. I was universally allowed to be the most famous dealer in cream cheese in Babylon, and yet I am ruined. I had the most handsome wife that any man in my station could have, and by her I have been betrayed. I had still left a paltry house, and that I have seen pillaged and destroyed. At last I took refuge in this cottage, where I have no other resource than fishing, and yet I cannot catch a single fish. O my net, no more will I throw thee into the water. I will throw myself in thy place." So saying, he arose, and advanced forward in the attitude of a man ready to throw himself into the river, and thus to finish his life. "What!" said Zadig to himself, "are there men as wretched as I?" His eagerness to save the fisherman's life was as this reflection. He ran to him, stopped him, and spoke to him with a tender and compassionate air. It is commonly supposed that we are less miserable when we have companions in our misery. This, according to Zoroaster, does not proceed from malice, but necessity. We feel ourselves insensibly drawn to an unhappy person as to one like ourselves. The joy of the happy would be an insult. But two men in distress are like two slender trees, which, mutually supporting each other, fortify themselves against the storm. "Why," said Zadig to the fisherman, "dost thou sink under thy misfortunes?" "Because," replied he, "I see no means of relief. I was the most considerable man in the village of Derlback, near Babylon, and with the assistance of my wife I made the best cream cheese in the empire. Queen Astarte and the famous minister Zadig were extremely fond of them." Zadig, transported, said, "What, knowst thou nothing of the queen's fate?" "No, my lord," replied the fisherman; "but I know that neither the queen nor Zadig has paid me for my cream cheeses; that I have lost my wife, and am now reduced to despair." "I flatter myself," said Zadig, "that thou wilt not lose all thy money. I have heard of this Zadig. He is an honest man, and if he returns to Babylon as he expects, he will give thee more than he owes thee. Believe me, go to Babylon. I shall be there before thee, because I am on horseback and thou art on foot. Apply to the illustrious Cador. Tell him thou hast met his friend. Wait for me at his house. Go; perhaps thou wilt not always be unhappy." "O powerful Oromazes," continued he, "thou employest me to comfort this man. Whom wilt thou employ to give me consolation?" So saying, he gave the fisherman half the money he had brought from Arabia. The fisherman, struck with surprise, and ravished with joy, kissed the feet of the friend of Cador, and said, "Thou art surely an angel sent from heaven to save me." Meanwhile Zadig continued to make fresh inquiries, and to shed tears. "What, my lord!" cried the fisherman, "art thou then so unhappy, thou who bestowest favors?" "An 100 times more unhappy than thou art," replied Zadig. "But how is it possible," said the good man, "that the giver can be more wretched than the receiver?" "Because," replied Zadig, "thy greatest misery arose from poverty, and mine is seated in the heart." "Did Orcan take thy wife from thee?" said the fisherman. This word recalled to Zadig's mind the whole of his adventures. He repeated the catalogue of his misfortunes, beginning with the queen's spaniel, and ending with his arrival at the castle of the robber Arbogad. "Ah," said he to the fisherman, "Orcan deserves to be punished, but it is commonly such men as those that are the favourites of fortune. However, go thou to the house of Lord Cador, and there wait my arrival." They then parted. The fisherman walked, thanking Heaven for the happiness of his condition, and Zadig rode, accusing fortune for the hardness of his lot. Section 20. of Library of World's Best Mystery and Detective Stories, Volume 4. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Darvinia. Library of the World's Best Mystery and Detective Stories, Volume 4, by Julian Hawthorne, Editor. Section 20. Zadig the Babylonian, by Voltaire. Part 3. The Basilisk. Arriving in a beautiful meadow, he there saw several women, who were searching for something with great application. He took the liberty to approach one of them, and to ask if he might have the honour to assist them in their search. "Take care that thou dost not," replied the Syrian. "What we are searching for can be touched only by women." "Strange," said Zadig. "May I presume to ask thee what it is that women only are permitted to touch?" "It is a basilisk," said she. "A basilisk, madam! And for what purpose, pray, dost thou seek for a basilisk?" "It is for our lord and master Ogul, whose cattle thou seest on the bank of that river at the end of the meadow. We are his most humble slaves. The lord Ogul is sick. His physician hath ordered him to eat a basilisk stewed in rose water; and as it is a very rare animal, and can only be taken by women, the lord Ogul hath promised to choose for his well-beloved wife the woman that shall bring him a basilisk. Let me go on in my search, for thou seest what I shall lose if I am prevented by my companions." Zadig left her and the other Assyrians to search for their basilisk, and continued to walk in the meadow. When coming to the brink of a small rivulet, he found another lady lying on the grass, and who was not searching for anything. Her person seemed to be majestic, but her face was covered with a veil. She was inclined toward the rivulet, and profound sighs proceeded from her mouth. In her hand she held a small rod, with which she was tracing characters on the fine sand that lay between the turf and the brook. Zadig had the curiosity to examine what this woman was writing. He drew near. He saw the letter Z, then an A. He was astonished. Then appeared a D. He started. But never was surprise equal to his when he saw the two last letters of his name. He stood for some time immovable. At last, breaking silence with a faltering voice, "O generous lady, pardon a stranger, an unfortunate man, for presuming to ask thee by what surprising adventure I here find the name of Zadig traced out by thy divine hand." At this voice, and these words, the lady lifted up the veil with a trembling hand, looked at Zadig, sent forth a cry of tenderness, surprise, and joy, and sinking under the various emotions which at once assaulted her soul, fell speechless into his arms. It was Astarte herself. It was the Queen of Babylon. It was she whom Zadig adored, and whom he had reproached himself for adoring. It was she whose misfortunes he had so deeply lamented, and for whose fate he had been so anxiously concerned. He was for a moment deprived of the use of his senses, when he had fixed his eyes on those of Astarte, which now began to open again, with a languor mixed with confusion and tenderness. "O ye mortal powers," cried he, "who preside over the fates of weak mortals, do ye indeed restore Astarte to me? At what a time, in what a place, and in what a condition do I again behold her?" He fell on his knees before Astarte, and laid his face in the dust at her feet. The Queen of Babylon raised him up, and made him sit by her side on the brink of the rivulet. She frequently wiped her eyes, from which the tears continued to flow afresh. She 20 times resumed her discourse, which her sighs as often interrupted. She asked by what strange accident they were brought together, and suddenly prevented his answers by other questions. She waived the account of her own misfortunes, and desired to be informed of those of Zadig. At last, both of them having a little composed the tumult of their souls, Zadig acquainted her in a few words by what adventure he was brought into that meadow. "But, O unhappy and respectable Queen, by what means do I find thee in this lonely place, clothed in the habit of a slave, and accompanied by other female slaves, who are searching for a basilisk, which by order of the physician is to be stewed in rose water?" "While they are searching for their basilisk," said the fair Astarte, "I will inform thee of all I have suffered, for which Heaven has sufficiently recompensed me by restoring thee to my sight. Thou knowest that the king, my husband, was vexed to see thee the most amiable of mankind, and that for this reason he one night resolved to strangle thee and poison me. Thou knowest how Heaven permitted my little mute to inform me of the orders of his sublime majesty. Hardly had the faithful Cador advised thee to depart, in obedience to my command, when he ventured to enter my apartment at midnight by a secret passage. He carried me off, and conducted me to the temple of Oromazes, where the Magi his brother shut me up in that huge statue whose base reaches to the foundation of the temple, and whose top rises to the summit of the dome. I was there buried in a manner, but was saved by the Magi, and supplied with all the necessaries of life. At break of day his Majesty's apothecary entered my chamber with a potion composed of a mixture of henbane, opium, hemlock, black hellebore, and aconite, and another officer went to thine with a bowstring of blue silk. Neither of us was to be found. Cador, the better to deceive the king, pretended to come and accuse us both. He said that thou hadst taken the road to Indies, and I that to Memphis, on which the king's guards were immediately dispatched in pursuit of us both. The couriers who pursued me did not know me. I had hardly ever shown my face to any but thee, and to thee only in the presence and by the order of my husband. They conducted themselves in the pursuit by the description that had been given them of my person. On the frontiers of Egypt they met with a woman of the same stature with me, and possessed perhaps of greater charms. She was weeping and wandering. They made no doubt but that this woman was the Queen of Babylon, and accordingly brought her to Moabdar. Their mistake at first threw the king into a violent passion, but having viewed this woman more attentively, he found her extremely handsome, and was comforted. She was called Missouf. I have since been informed that this name in the Egyptian language signifies the capricious fair one. She was so in reality, but she had as much cunning as caprice. She pleased Moabdar, and gained such an ascendancy over him as to make him choose her for his wife. Her character then began to appear in its true colours. She gave herself up without scruple to all the freaks of a wanton imagination. She would have obliged the chief of the Magi, who was old and gouty, to dance before her, and on his refusal she persecuted him with the most unrelenting cruelty. She ordered her master of the horse to make her a pie of sweetmeats. In vain did he represent that he was not a pastry cook. He was obliged to make it, and lost his place because it was baked a little too hard. The post of master of the horse she gave to her dwarf, and that of chancellor to her page. In this manner did she govern Babylon. Everybody regretted the loss of me. The king, who till the moment of his resolving to poison me and strangle thee had been a tolerably good kind of man, seemed now to have drowned all his virtues in his immoderate fondness for this capricious fair one. He came to the temple on the great day of the feast held in honour of the sacred fire. I saw him implore the gods in behalf of Missouf at the feet of the statue in which I was enclosed. I raised my voice. I cried out, "The gods reject the prayers of a king who is now become a tyrant, and who attempted to murder a reasonable wife, in order to marry a woman remarkable for nothing but her folly and extravagance." At these words Moabdar was confounded, and his head became disordered. The oracle I had pronounced, and the tyranny of Missouf, conspired to deprive him of his judgment, and in a few days his reason entirely forsook him. Moabdar's madness, which seemed to be the judgment of heaven, was the signal to a revolt. The people rose and ran to arms, and Babylon, which had been so long immersed in idleness and effeminacy, became the theatre of a bloody civil war. I was taken from the heart of my statue, and placed at the head of a party. Cador flew to Memphis to bring thee back to Babylon. The prince of Hyrcania, informed of these fatal events, returned with his army, and made a third party in Chaldea. He attacked the king, who fled before him with his capricious Egyptian. Moabdar died pierced with wounds. I myself had the misfortune to be taken by a party of Hyrcanians, who conducted me to their prince's tent, at the very moment that Missouf was brought before him. Thou wilt doubtless be pleased to hear that the prince thought me beautiful, but thou wilt be sorry to be informed that he designed me for his seraglio. He told me with a blunt and resolute air, that as soon as he had finished a military expedition, which he was just going to undertake, he would come to me. Judge how great must have been my grief. My ties with Moabdar were already dissolved. I might have been the wife of Zadig, and I was fallen into the hands of a barbarian. I answered him with all the pride which my high rank and noble sentiment could inspire. I had always heard it affirmed that heaven stamped on persons of my condition a mark of grandeur, which, with a single word or glance, could reduce to the lowliness of the most profound respect those rash and forward persons who presume to deviate from the rules of politeness. I spoke like a queen, but was treated like a maidservant. The Hyrcanian, without even deigning to speak to me, told his black eunuch that I was impertinent, but that he thought me handsome. He ordered him to take care of me, and to put me under the regime of favourites, that so my complexion being improved, I might be the more worthy of his favours when he should be at leisure to honour me with them. I told him that rather than submit to his desires, I would put an end to my life. He replied with a smile, that women, he believed, were not so bloodthirsty, and that he was accustomed to such violent expressions, and then left me with the air of a man who had just put another parrot into his aviary. What a state for the first queen of the universe, and what is more, for a heart devoted to Zadig! At these words Zadig threw himself at her feet, and bathed them with his tears. Astarte raised him with great tenderness, and thus continued her story. I now saw myself in the power of a barbarian, and rival to the foolish woman with whom I was confined. She gave me an account of her adventures in Egypt. From the description she gave me of your person, from the time, from the dromedary on which you were mounted, and from every other circumstance, I inferred that Zadig was the man who had fought for her. I doubted not but that you were at Memphis, and therefore resolved to repair thither. Beautiful Misoph, said I, thou art more handsome than I, and will please the Prince of Hyrcania much better. Assist me in contriving the means of my escape. Thou wilt then reign alone. Thou wilt at once make me happy, and rid thyself of a rival. Misoph concerted with me the means of my flight, and I departed secretly with a female Egyptian slave. As I approached the frontiers of Arabia, a famous robber named Arbogad seized me, and sold me to some merchants, who brought me to this castle, where Lord Ogul resides. He bought me without knowing who I was. He is a voluptuary, ambitious of nothing but good living, and thinks that God sent him into the world for no other purpose than to sit at table. He is so extremely corpulent that he is always in danger of suffocation. His physician, who has but little credit with him when he has a good digestion, governs him with a despotic sway when he has ate too much. He has persuaded him that a basilisk stewed in rosewater will effect a complete cure. The Lord Ogul hath promised his hand to the female slave that brings him a basilisk. Thou seest that I leave them to vie with each other in meriting this honour, and never was I less desirous of finding the basilisk than since Heaven hath restored thee to my sight." This account was succeeded by a long conversation between Astarte and Zadig, consisting of everything that their long suppressed sentiments, their great sufferings, and their mutual love could inspire into hearts the most noble and tender; and the genii who preside over love carried their words to the sphere of Venus. The women returned to Ogul without having found the basilisk. Zadig was introduced to this mighty lord, and spoke to him in the following terms: "May immortal health descend from heaven to bless all thy days! I am a physician. At the first report of thy indisposition, I flew to thy castle, and have now brought thee a basilisk stewed in rosewater. Not that I pretend to marry thee. All I ask is the liberty of a Babylonian slave, who hath been in thy possession for a few days. And if I should not be so happy as to cure thee, magnificent Lord Ogul, I consent to remain a slave in her place." The proposal was accepted. Astarte set out for Babylon with Zadig's servant, promising immediately upon her arrival to send a courier to inform him of all that had happened. Their parting was as tender as their meeting. The moment of meeting and that of parting are the two greatest epochs of life, as saith the great book of Zend. Zadig loved the queen with as much ardour as he professed, and the queen more than she thought proper to acknowledge. Meanwhile Zadig spoke thus to Ogul: "My lord, my basilisk is not to be eaten. All its virtues must enter through thy pores. I have enclosed it in a little ball, blown up and covered with a fine skin. Thou must strike this ball with all thy might, and I must strike it back for a considerable time, and by observing this regime for a few days thou wilt see the effects of my art." The first day Ogul was out of breath, and thought he should have died with fatigue. The second he was less fatigued, slept better. In 8 days he recovered all the strength, all the health, all the agility and cheerfulness of his most agreeable years. "Thou hast played at ball, and thou hast been temperate," said Zadig. "Know that there is no such thing in nature as a basilisk; that temperance and exercise are the two great preservatives of health; and that the art of reconciling intemperance and health is as chimerical as the philosopher's stone, judicial astrology, or the theology of the Magi. Ogul's first physician, observing how dangerous this man might prove to the medical art, formed a design, in conjunction with the apothecary, to send Zadig to search for a basilisk in the other world. Thus, having suffered such a long train of calamities on account of his good actions, he was now upon the point of losing his life for curing a gluttonous lord. He was invited to an excellent dinner, and was to have been poisoned in the second course; but during the first he happily received a courier from the fair Astarte. "When one is beloved by a beautiful woman," says the great Zoroaster, "he hath always the good fortune to extricate himself out of every kind of difficulty and danger." The combats. The queen was received at Babylon with all those transports of joy which are ever felt on the return of a beautiful princess who hath been involved in calamities. Babylon was now in greater tranquillity. The prince of Hyrcania had been killed in battle. The victorious Babylonians declared that the queen should marry the man whom they should choose for their sovereign. They were resolved that the first place in the world, that of being husband to Astarte and king of Babylon, should not depend on cabals and intrigues. They swore to acknowledge for king the man who, upon trial, should be found to be possessed of the greatest valor and the greatest wisdom. Accordingly, at the distance of a few leagues from the city, a spacious place was marked out for the list, surrounded with magnificent amphitheaters. Thither the combatants were to repair in complete armor. Each of them had a separate apartment behind the amphitheaters, where they were neither to be seen nor known by any one. Each was to encounter 4 knights, and those that were so happy as to conquer 4 were then to engage with one another, so that he who remained the last master of the field would be proclaimed conqueror at the games. 4 days after, he was to return with the same arms, and to explain the enigmas proposed by the Magi. If he did not explain the enigmas, he was not king; and the running at the lances was to be begun afresh, till a man would be found who was conqueror in both these combats, for they were absolutely determined to have a king possessed of the greatest wisdom and the most invincible courage. The queen was all the while to be strictly guarded. She was only allowed to be present at the games, and even there she was to be covered with a veil, but was not permitted to speak to any of the competitors, that so they might neither receive favor nor suffer injustice. These particulars Astarte communicated to her lover, hoping that in order to obtain her he would show himself possessed of greater courage and wisdom than any other person. Zadig set out on his journey, beseeching Venus to fortify his courage and enlighten his understanding. He arrived on the banks of the Euphrates on the eve of this great day. He caused his device to be inscribed among those of the combatants, concealing his face and his name as the law ordained, and then went to repose himself in the apartment that fell to him by lot. His friend Cador, who, after the fruitless search he had made for him in Egypt, was now returned to Babylon, sent to his tent a complete suit of armor, which was a present from the queen, as also from himself one of the finest horses in Persia. Zadig presently perceived that these presents were sent by Astarte, and from thence his courage derived fresh strength, and his love the most animating hopes. Next day, the queen being seated under a canopy of jewels, and the amphitheaters filled with all the gentlemen and ladies of rank in Babylon, the combatants appeared in the circus. Each of them came and laid his device at the feet of the grand Magi. They drew their devices by lot, and that of Zadig was the last. The first who advanced was a certain lord named Itobad, very rich and very vain, but possessed of little courage, of less address, and hardly of any judgment at all. His servants had persuaded him that such a man as he ought to be king. He had said in reply, "Such a man as I ought to reign." And thus they had armed him for a capapi. He wore an armour of gold enamelled with green, a plume of green feathers, and a lance adorned with green ribbons. It was instantly perceived by the manner in which Itobad managed his horse that it was not for such a man as he that Heaven reserved the sceptre of Babylon. The first knight that ran against him threw him out of his saddle. The second laid him flat on his horse's buttocks, with his legs in the air, and his arms extended. Itobad recovered himself, but with so bad a grace that the whole amphitheatre burst out a-laughing. The third knight disdained to make use of his lance, but, making a pass at him, took him by the right leg, and wheeling him half round, laid him prostrate on the sand. The squires of the game ran to him laughing, and replaced him in his saddle. The fourth combatant took him by the left leg, and tumbled him down on the other side. He was conducted back with scornful shouts to his tent, where, according to the law, he was to pass the night; and as he limped along with great difficulty, he said, "What an adventure for such a man as I!" The other knights acquitted themselves with greater ability and success. Some of them conquered 2 combatants, a few of them vanquished 3, but none but Prince Otamus conquered 4. At last Zadig fought him in his turn. He successfully threw 4 knights off their saddles with all the grace imaginable. It then remained to be seen who should be conqueror, Otamus or Zadig. The arms of the first were gold and blue, with a plume of the same color; those of the last were white. The wishes of all the spectators were divided between the knight in blue and the knight in white. The queen, whose heart was in a violent palpitation, offered prayers to Heaven for the success of the white color. The 2 champions made their passes and vaults with so much agility, they mutually gave and received such dexterous blows with their lances, and sat so firmly in their saddles, that everybody but the queen wished there might be 2 kings in Babylon. At length, their horses being tired, and their lances broken, Zadig had recourse to his stratagem. He passes behind the Blue Prince, springs upon the buttocks of his horse, seizes him by the middle, throws him on the earth, places himself in the saddle, and wheels around Otamus as he lay extended on the ground. All the amphitheatre cried out, "Victory to the White Knight!" Otamus rises in a violent passion, and draws his sword. Zadig leaps from his horse with his sabre in his hand. Both of them are now on the ground, engaged in a new combat, where strength and agility triumph by turns. The plumes of their helmets, the studs of their bracelets, the rings of their armor, are driven to a great distance by the violence of 1,000 furious blows. They strike with the point and the edge, to the right, to the left, on the head, on the breast. They retreat, they advance, they measure swords, they close, they seize each other, they bend like serpents, they attack like lions, and the fire every moment flashes from their blows. At last Zadig, having recovered his spirits, stops, makes a feint, leaps upon Otamus, throws him on the ground, and disarms him, and Otamus cries out, "It is thou alone, O White Knight, that oughtest to reign over Babylon." The queen was now at the height of her joy. The knight in blue armor and the knight in white were conducted each to his own apartment, as well as all the others, according to the intention of the law. Mutes came to wait upon them and to serve them at table. It may be easily supposed that the queen's little mute waited upon Zadig. They were then left to themselves to enjoy the sweets of repose till next morning, at which time the conqueror was to bring his device to the grand magi, to compare it with that which he had left, and make himself known. Zadig, though deeply in love, was so much fatigued that he could not help sleeping. Itobad, who lay near him, never closed his eyes. He arose in the night, entered his apartment, took the white arms and the device of Zadig, and put his green armor in their place. At break of day he went boldly to the grand magi to declare that so great a man as he was conqueror. This was little expected. However, he was proclaimed while Zadig was still asleep. Astarte, surprised and filled with despair, returned to Babylon. The amphitheatre was almost empty when Zadig awoke. He sought for his arms, but could find none but the green armor. With this he was obliged to cover himself, having nothing else near him. Astonished and enraged, he put it on in a furious passion, and advanced in this equipage. The people that still remained in the amphitheatre and the circus received him with hoots and hisses. They surrounded him and insulted him to his face. Never did man suffer such cruel mortifications. He lost his patience. With his sabre he dispersed such of the populace as dared to affront him. But he knew not what course to take. He could not see the queen, he could not claim the white armor she had sent him, without exposing her. And thus, while she was plunged in grief, he was filled with fury and distraction. He walked on the banks of the Euphrates, fully persuaded that his star had destined him to inevitable misery, and resolving in his own mind all his misfortunes, from the adventure of the woman who hated one-eyed men to that of his armor. "This," said he, "is the consequence of my having slept too long. Had I slept less, I should now have been king of Babylon and in possession of Astarte. Knowledge, virtue, and courage have hitherto served only to make me miserable." He then let fall some secret murmurings against Providence, and was tempted to believe that the world was governed by a cruel destiny, which oppressed the good and prospered knights in green armor. One of his greatest mortifications was his being obliged to wear that green armor, which had exposed him to such contumelious treatment. A merchant happening to pass by, he sold it to him for a trifle, and bought a gown and a long bonnet. In this garb he proceeded along the banks of the Euphrates, filled with despair, and secretly accusing Providence, which thus continued to persecute him with unremitting severity. End of Section 20. Section 21 of Library of World's Best Mystery and Detective Stories, Volume 4. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Darvinia. Library of the World's Best Mystery and Detective Stories, Volume 4, by Julian Hawthorne, Editor. Section 21. Zadig the Babylonian, by Voltaire. Part 4. The Hermit. While he was thus sauntering, he met a hermit, whose white and venerable beard hung down to his girdle. He held a book in his hand, which he read with great attention. Zadig stopped, and made him a profound obeisance. The hermit returned the compliment with such a noble and engaging air, that Zadig had the curiosity to enter into conversation with him. He asked him what book it was that he had been reading. "It is the Book of Destinies," said the hermit. "Wouldst thou choose to look into it?" He put the book into the hands of Zadig, who, thoroughly versed as he was in several languages, could not decipher a single character of it. This only redoubled his curiosity. "Thou seemest," said this good father, "to be in great distress." "Alas," replied Zadig, "I have but too much reason." "If thou wilt permit me to accompany thee," resumed the old man, "perhaps I may be of some service to thee. I have often poured the balm of consolation into the bleeding heart of the unhappy." Zadig felt himself inspired with respect for the air, the beard, and the book of the hermit. He found, in the course of the conversation, that he was possessed of superior degrees of knowledge. The hermit talked of fate, of justice, of morals, of the chief good, of human weakness, and of virtue and vice, with such a spirited and moving eloquence, that Zadig felt himself drawn toward him by an irresistible charm. He earnestly entreated the favor of his company till their return to Babylon. "I ask the same favor of thee," said the old man. "Swear to me by Oromazes, that whatever I do, thou wilt not leave me for some days." Zadig swore, and they set out together. In the evening the two travelers arrived in a superb castle. The hermit entreated a hospitable reception for himself and the young man who accompanied him. The porter, whom one might have easily mistaken for a great lord, introduced them with a kind of disdainful civility. He presented them to a principal domestic, who showed them his master's magnificent apartments. They were admitted to the lower end of the table, without being honored with the least mark of regard by the lord of the castle; but they were served, like the rest, with delicacy and profusion. They were then presented with water to wash their hands, in a golden basin adorned with emeralds and rubies. At last they were conducted to bed in a beautiful apartment, and in the morning a domestic brought each of them a piece of gold, after which they took their leave and departed. "The master of the house," said Zadig, as they were proceeding on the journey, "appears to be a generous man, though somewhat too proud. He nobly performs the duties of hospitality." At that instant he observed that a kind of large pocket, which the hermit had, was filled and distended, and upon looking more narrowly, he found that it contained the golden basin adorned with precious stones, which the hermit had stolen. He durst not take any notice of it, but he was filled with a strange surprise. About noon the hermit came to the door of a paltry house inhabited by a rich miser, and begged the favor of a hospitable reception for a few hours. An old servant, in a tattered garb, received them with a blunt and rude air, and led them into the stable, where he gave them some rotten olives, mouldy bread, and sour beer. The hermit ate and drank with as much seeming satisfaction as he had done the evening before, and then, addressing himself to the old servant, who watched them both to prevent their stealing anything, and rudely pressed them to depart, he gave him the 2 pieces of gold he had received in the morning, and thanked him for his great civility. "Pray," added he, "allow me to speak to thy master." The servant, filled with astonishment, introduced the 2 travelers. "Magnificent lord," said the hermit, "I cannot but return thee my most humble thanks for the noble manner in which thou hast entertained us. Be pleased to accept this golden basin as a small mark of my gratitude." The miser started, and was ready to fall backward; but the hermit, without giving him time to recover from his surprise, instantly departed with his young fellow traveler. "Father," said Zadig, "what is the meaning of all this? Thou seemest to me to be entirely different from other men. Thou stealest a golden basin, adorned with precious stones, from a lord who received thee magnificently, and givest it to a miser who treats thee with indignity." "Son," replied the old man, "this magnificent lord, who receives strangers only from vanity and ostentation, will hereby be rendered more wise, and the miser will learn to practice the duties of hospitality. Be surprised at nothing, but follow me." Zadig knew not as yet whether he was in company with the most foolish or the most prudent of mankind; but the hermit spoke with such an ascendancy, that Zadig, who was moreover bound by his oath, could not refuse to follow him. In the evening they arrived at a house built with equal elegance and simplicity, where nothing favored either of prodigality or avarice. The master of it was a philosopher who had retired from the world, and who cultivated in peace the study of virtue and wisdom, without any of that rigid and morose severity so commonly to be found in men of his character. he had chosen to build this country house, in which he received strangers with a generosity free from ostentation. He went himself to meet the two travellers, whom he led into a commodious apartment, where he desired them to repose themselves a little. Soon after he came and invited them to a decent and well-ordered repast, during which he spoke with great judgment of the last revolutions in Babylon. He seemed to be strongly attached to the queen, and wished that Zadig had appeared in the lists to dispute the crown. "But the people," added he, "do not deserve to have such a king as Zadig." Zadig blushed, and felt his griefs redoubled. They agreed, in the course of the conversation, that the things of this world did not always answer the wishes of the wise. The hermit still maintained that the ways of Providence were inscrutable, and that men were in the wrong to judge of a whole, of which they understood but the smallest part. They talked of passions. "Ah," said Zadig, "how fatal are their effects!" "They are in the winds," replied the hermit, "that swells the sails of the ship. It is true they sometimes sink her, but without them she could not sail at all. The bile makes us sick and choleric, but without bile we could not live. Everything in this world is dangerous, and yet everything is necessary." The conversation turned on pleasure, and the hermit proved that it was a present bestowed by the deity. "For," said he, "man cannot give himself either sensations or ideas; he receives all, and pain and pleasure proceed from a foreign cause as well as his being." Zadig was surprised to see a man, who had been guilty of such extravagant actions, capable of reasoning with so much judgment and propriety. At last, after a conversation equally entertaining and instructive, the host led back his two guests to their apartment, blessing Heaven for having sent him two men possessed of so much wisdom and virtue. He offered them money with such an easy and noble air as could not possibly give any offence. The hermit refused it, and said that he must now take his leave of him, as he set out for Babylon before it was light. Their parting was tender. Zadig especially felt himself filled with esteem and affection for a man of such an amiable character. When he and the hermit were alone in their apartment, they spent a long time in praising their host. At break of day the old man awakened his companion. "We must now depart," said he; "but, while all the family are still asleep, I will leave this man a mark of my esteem and affection." So saying, he took a candle, and set fire to the house. Zadig, struck with horror, cried aloud, and endeavored to hinder him from committing such a barbarous action; but the hermit drew him away by a superior force, and the house was soon in flames. The hermit, who, with his companion, was already at a considerable distance, looked back to the conflagration with great tranquillity. "Thanks be to God," said he, "the house of my dear host is entirely destroyed. Happy man!" At these words Zadig was at once tempted to burst out a laughing, to reproach the reverend father, to beat him, and to run away. But he did none of all of these, for, still subdued by the powerful ascendancy of the hermit, he followed him, in spite of himself, to the next stage. This was at the house of a charitable and virtuous widow, who had a nephew 14 years of age, a handsome and promising youth, and her only hope. She performed the honours of her house as well as she could. Next day she ordered her nephew to accompany the strangers to a bridge, which, being lately broken down, was becoming extremely dangerous in passing. The young man walked before them with great alacrity. As they were crossing the bridge, "Come," said the hermit to the youth, "I must show my gratitude to thy aunt." He then took him by the hair and plunged him into the river. The boy sunk, appeared again on the surface of the water, and was swallowed up by the current. "O monster! O thou most wicked of mankind!" cried Zadig. "Thou promised to behave with greater patience," said the hermit, interrupting him. "Know that under the ruins of that house which Providence hath set on fire, the master hath found an immense treasure. Know that this young man, whose life Providence hath shortened, would have assassinated his aunt in the space of a year, and thee in that of 2." "Who told thee so, barbarian?" cried Zadig; "and though thou hast read this event in thy book of destinies, art thou permitted to drown a youth who never did thee any harm?" While the Babylonian was thus exclaiming, he observed that the old man had no longer a beard, and that his countenance assumed the features and complexion of youth. The hermit's habit disappeared, and 4 beautiful wings covered a majestic body resplendent with light. "O sent of heaven! O divine angel!" cried Zadig, humbly prostrating himself on the ground. "Hast thou then descended from the Empyrean to teach a weak mortal to submit to the eternal decrees of Providence?" "Men," said the angel Jesrad, "judge of all without knowing anything, and of all men thou best deservest to be enlightened." Zadig begged to be permitted to speak. "I distrust myself," said he, "but may I presume to ask the favor of thee to clear up one doubt that still remains in my mind? Would it not have been better to have corrected this youth, and made him virtuous, than to have drowned him?" "Had he been virtuous," replied Jesrad, "and enjoyed a longer life, it would have been his fate to be assassinated himself, together with the wife he would have married, and the child he would have had by her." "But why," said Zadig, "is it necessary that there should be crimes and misfortunes, and that these misfortunes should fall on the good?" "The wicked," replied Jesrad, "are always unhappy. They serve to prove and try the small number of the just that are scattered through the earth; and there is no evil that is not productive of some good." "But," said Zadig, "suppose there were nothing but good, and no evil at all?" "Then," replied Jesrad, "this earth would be another earth. The chain of events would be ranged in another order, and directed by wisdom. But this other order, which would be perfect, can exist only in the eternal abode of the Supreme Being, to which no evil can approach. The Deity hath created millions of worlds, among which there is not one that resembles another. This immense variety is the effect of his immense power. There are not 2 leaves among the trees of the earth, nor 2 globes in the unlimited expanse of heaven that are exactly similar. And all that thou seest on the little atom in which thou art born ought to be in its proper time and place, according to the immutable decree of Him who comprehends all. Men think that this child who hath just perished is fallen into the water by chance, and that it is by the same chance that this house is burned. But there is no such thing as chance. All is either a trial or a punishment, or a reward or a foresight. Remember the fisherman who thought himself the most wretched of mankind? Oramazes sent thee to change his fate. Cease, then, frail mortal, to dispute against what thou oughtest to adore." "But," said Zadig. As he pronounced the word "but," the angel took his flight toward the 10th sphere. Zadig on his knees adored Providence, and submitted. The angel cried to him from on high, "Direct thy course toward Babylon." The Enigmas. Zadig, entranced, as it were, and like a man about whose head the thunder had burst, walked at random. He entered Babylon on the very day when those who had fought at the tournaments were assembled in the grand vestibule of the palace, to explain the enigmas, and to answer the questions of the Grand Magi. All the knights were already arrived, except the knight in green armour. As soon as Zadig appeared in the city, the people crowded round him, every eye was fixed on him, every mouth blessed him, and every heart wished him the empire. The envious man saw him pass. He frowned and turned aside. The people conducted him to the place where the assembly was held. The queen, who was informed of his arrival, became a prey to the most violent agitations of hope and fear. She was filled with anxiety and apprehension. She could not comprehend why Zadig was without arms, nor why Itobad wore the white armour. A confused murmur arose at the sight of Zadig. They were equally surprised and charmed to see him, but none but the knights who had fought were permitted to appear in the assembly. "I have fought as well as the other knights," said Zadig, "but another here wears my arms; and while I wait for the honour of proving the truth of my assertion, I demand the liberty of presenting myself to explain the enigmas." The question was put to the vote, and his reputation for probity was still so deeply impressed in their minds that they admitted him without scruple. The first question proposed by the Grand Magi was, "What, of all things in the world, is the longest and the shortest, the swiftest and the slowest, the most divisible and the most extended, the most neglected and the most regretted, without which nothing can be done, which devours all that is little, and enlivens all that is great?" Itobad was to speak. He replied that so great a man as he did not understand enigmas, and that it was sufficient for him to have conquered by his strength and valour. Some said that the meaning of the enigmas was fortune, some the earth, and others the light. Zadig said that it was time. "Nothing," added he, "is longer, since it is the measure of eternity. Nothing is shorter, since it is insufficient for the accomplishment of our projects. Nothing more slow to him that expects, nothing more rapid to him that enjoys. In greatness it extends to infinity. In smallness it is infinitely divisible. All men neglect it, all regret the loss of it. Nothing can be done without it. It consigns to oblivion whatever is unworthy of being transmitted to posterity, and it immortalizes such actions as are truly great." The assembly acknowledged that Zadig was in the right. The next question was, "What is the thing which we receive without thanks, which we enjoy without knowing how, which we give to others when we know not where we are, and which we lose without perceiving it?" Every one gave his own explanation. Zadig alone guessed that it was life, and explained all the other enigmas with the same facility. Itobad always said that nothing was more easy, and that he could have answered them with the same readiness had he chosen to have given himself the trouble. Questions were then proposed on justice, on the sovereign good, and on the art of government. Zadig's answers were judged to be the most solid. "What a pity is it," said they, "that such a great genius should be so bad a knight!" "Illustrious lords," said Zadig, "I have had the honour of conquering in the tournaments. It is to me that the white armour belongs. Lord Itobad took possession of it during my sleep. He probably thought that it would fit him better than the green. I am now ready to prove, in your presence, with my gown and sword, against all that beautiful white armour which he took from me, that it is I who have had the honour of conquering the brave Otamus." Itobad accepted the challenge with the greatest confidence. He never doubted but what, armed as he was with a helmet, a cuirass, and brassarts, that he would obtain an easy victory over a champion in a cap and nightgown. Zadig drew his sword, saluting the queen, who looked at him with a mixture of fear and joy. Itobad drew his without saluting any one. He rushed upon Zadig like a man who had nothing to fear. He was ready to cleave him in two. Zadig knew how to ward off his blows, by opposing the strongest part of his sword to the weakest of that of his adversary, in such a manner that Itobad's sword was broken. Upon which Zadig, seizing his enemy by the waist, threw him on the ground, and fixing the point of his sword at the breastplate, "Suffer thyself to be disarmed," said he, "or thou art a dead man." Itobad, always surprised at the disgraces that happened to such a man as he, was obliged to yield to Zadig, who took from him with great composure his magnificent helmet, his superb cuirass, his fine brassards, his shining cuishes, clothed himself with them, and in this dress ran to throw himself at the feet of Astarte. Cador easily proved that the armor belonged to Zadig. He was acknowledged king by the unanimous consent of the whole nation, and especially by that of Astarte, who, after so many calamities, now tasted the exquisite pleasure of seeing her lover worthy, in the eyes of all the world, to be her husband. Itobad went home to be called lord in his own house. Zadig was king, and was happy. The queen and Zadig adored Providence. He sent in search of the robber Arbogad, to whom he gave an honorable post in his army, promising to advance him to the first dignities if he behaved like a true warrior, and threatening to hang him if he followed the profession of a robber. Setoc, with the fair Almona, was called from the heart of Arabia, and placed at the head of the commerce of Babylon. Cador was preferred and distinguished according to his great services. He was the friend of the king, and the king was then the only monarch on earth that had a friend. The little mute was not forgotten. But neither could the beautiful Semira be comforted for having believed that Zadig would be blind of an eye, nor did Azora cease to lament her having attempted to cut off his nose. Their griefs, however, he softened by his presence. The envious man died of rage and shame. The empire enjoyed peace, glory, and plenty. This was the happiest age of the earth. It was governed by love and justice. The people blessed Zadig, and Zadig blessed heaven. End of section 21.
Section 22 of Library of the World's Best Mystery and Detective Stories, Volume 4. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Karen Savage. Library of the World's Best Mystery and Detective Stories, Volume 4, by Julian Hawthorne, Editor. Section 22, The Nail, by Pedro de Alarcón, Part 1. 1. The thing which is most ardently desired by a man who steps into a stagecoach, bent upon a long journey, is that his companions may be agreeable, that they may have the same tastes, possibly the same vices, be well educated, and know enough not to be too familiar. When I opened the door of the coach, I felt fearful of encountering an old woman suffering with the asthma, an ugly one who could not bear the smell of tobacco smoke, one who gets seasick every time she rides in a carriage, and little angels who are continually yelling and screaming for God knows what. Sometimes you may have hoped to have a beautiful woman for a travelling companion. For instance, a widow of 20 or 30 years of age, let us say 36, whose delightful conversation will help you pass away the time. But if you ever had this idea, as a reasonable man you would quickly dismiss it, for you know that such good fortune does not fall to the lot of the ordinary mortal. These thoughts were in my mind when I opened the door of the stagecoach at exactly 11 o'clock on a stormy night of the autumn of 1844. I had ticket number 2, and I was wondering who number 1 might be. The ticket agent had assured me that number 3 had not been sold. It was pitch dark within. When I entered, I said, "Good evening," but no answer came. "The devil," I said to myself, "is my travelling companion deaf, dumb, or asleep?" Then I said in a louder tone, "Good evening," but no answer came. All this time the stagecoach was whirling along, drawn by 10 horses. I was puzzled. Who was my companion? Was it a man? Was it a woman? Who was the silent number 1? And whoever it might be, why did he or she not reply to my courteous salutation? It would have been well to have lit a match, but I was not smoking then and had none with me. What should I do? I concluded to rely upon my sense of feeling, and stretched out my hand to the place where number 1 should have been, wondering whether I would touch a silk dress or an overcoat. But there was nothing there. At that moment a flash of lightning, herald of a quickly approaching storm, lit up the night, and I perceived that there was no one in the coach excepting myself. I burst out into a roar of laughter, and yet a moment later I could not help wondering what had become of number 1. A half-hour later we arrived at the first stop, and I was just about to ask the guard, who flashed his lantern into the compartment, why there was no number 1, when she entered. In the yellow rays I thought it was a vision, a pale, graceful, beautiful woman, dressed in deep mourning. Here was the fulfillment of my dream, the widow I had hoped for. I extended my hand to the unknown to assist her into the coach, and she sat down beside me, murmuring, "Thank you, sir, good evening," but in a tone that was so sad that it went to my very heart. How unfortunate, I thought. There are only 50 miles between here and Malaga. I wish to heaven this coach were going to Kamschatka. The guard slammed the door, and we were in darkness. I wished that the storm would continue, and that we might have a few more flashes of lightning, but the storm didn't. It fled away, leaving only a few pallid stars, whose light practically amounted to nothing. I made a brave effort to start a conversation. "Do you feel well? Are you going to Malaga? Did you like the Alhambra? You come from Granada? Isn't the night damp?" To which questions she respectively responded, "Thanks, very well." "Yes." "No, sir." "Yes." "Awful." It was quite certain that my travelling companion was not inclined to conversation. I tried to think up something original to say to her, but nothing occurred to me. So I lost myself for the moment in meditation. Why had this woman gotten on the stage at the first stop instead of at Granada? Why was she alone? Was she married? Was she really a widow? Why was she so sad? I certainly had no right to ask her any of these questions, and yet she interested me. How I wished the sun would rise. In the daytime one may talk freely, but in the pitch darkness one feels a certain oppression. It seems like taking an unfair advantage. My unknown did not sleep a moment during the night. I could tell this by her breathing and by her sighing. It is probably unnecessary to add that I did not sleep either. Once I asked her, "Do you feel ill?" and she replied, "No, sir, thank you. I beg pardon if I have disturbed your sleep." "Sleep?" I exclaimed disdainfully. "I do not care to sleep. I feared you were suffering." "Oh, no," she exclaimed, in a voice that contradicted her words. "I am not suffering." At last the sun rose. How beautiful she was! I mean the woman, not the sun. What deep suffering had lined her face and lurked in the depths of her beautiful eyes. She was elegantly dressed, and evidently belonged to a good family. Every gesture bore the imprint of distinction. She was the kind of a woman you expect to see in the principal box at the opera, resplendent with jewels, surrounded by admirers. We breakfasted at Colmenar. After that my companion became more confidential, and I said to myself when again we entered the coach, "Philip, you have met your fate. It's now or never." 2. I regretted the very first word I mentioned to her regarding my feelings. She became a block of ice, and I lost at once all that I might have gained in her good graces. Still she answered me very kindly. "It is not because it is you, sir, who speak to me of love, but love itself is something which I hold in horror." "But why, dear lady?" I inquired. "Because my heart is dead, because I have loved to the point of delirium, and I have been deceived." I felt that I should talk to her in a philosophic way, and there were a lot of platitudes on the tip of my tongue, but I refrained. I knew that she meant what she said. When we arrived at Malaga, she said to me in a tone I shall never forget as long as I live, "I thank you 1,000 times for your kind attention during the trip, and hope you will forgive me if I do not tell you my name and address." "Do you mean, then, that we shall not meet again?" "Never. And you especially should not regret it." And then, with a smile that was utterly without joy, she extended her exquisite hand to me and said, "Pray to God for me." I pressed her hand and made a low bow. She entered a handsome victoria which was awaiting her, and as it moved away, she bowed to me again. 2 months later I met her again. At 2 o'clock in the afternoon I was jogging along in an old cart on the road that leads to Cordova. The object of my journey was to examine some land which I owned in that neighborhood, and pass 3 or 4 weeks with one of the judges of the Supreme Court, who was an intimate friend of mine, and had been my schoolmate at the University of Granada. He received me with open arms. As I entered his handsome house, I could but note the perfect taste and elegance of the furniture and decorations. "Ah, Sarko," I said, "you have married, and you have never told me about it. Surely this was not the way to treat a man who loved you as much as I do." "I am not married, and what is more, I never will marry," answered the judge sadly. "I believe that you are not married, dear boy, since you say so, but I cannot understand the declaration that you never will. You must be joking." "I swear that I am telling you the truth," he replied. "But what a metamorphosis!" I exclaimed. "You were always a partisan of marriage, and for the past 2 years you have been writing to me and advising me to take a life partner. Whence this wonderful change, dear friend? Something must have happened to you. Something unfortunate, I fear." "To me?" answered the judge, somewhat embarrassed. "Yes, to you. Something has happened, and you are going to tell me all about it. You live here alone, have practically buried yourself in this great house. Come, tell me everything." The judge pressed my hand. "Yes, yes, you shall know all. There is no man more unfortunate than I am. But listen. This is the day upon which all the inhabitants go to the cemetery, and I must be there, if only for form's sake. Come with me. It is a pleasant afternoon, and the walk will do you good, after riding so long in that old cart. The location of the cemetery is a beautiful one, and I am quite sure you will enjoy the walk. On our way, I will tell you the incident that ruined my life, and you shall judge yourself whether I am justified in my hatred of women." As together we walked along the flower-bordered road, my friend told me the following story. 2 years ago, when I was assistant district attorney I obtained permission from my chief to spend a month in Sevilla. In the hotel where I lodged there was a beautiful young woman who passed for a widow, but whose origin, as well as her reasons for staying in that town, were a mystery to all. Her installation, her wealth, her total lack of friends or acquaintances, and the sadness of her expression, together with her incomparable beauty, gave rise to 1,000 conjectures. Her rooms were directly opposite mine, and I frequently met her in the hall or on the stairway, only too glad to have the chance of bowing to her. She was unapproachable, however, and it was impossible for me to secure an introduction. 2 weeks later, fate was to afford me the opportunity of entering her apartment. I had been to the theatre that night, and when I returned to my room, I thoughtlessly opened the door of her apartment instead of that of my own. The beautiful woman was reading by the light of the lamp and started when she saw me. I was so embarrassed by my mistake that for a moment I could only stammer unintelligible words. My confusion was so evident that she could not doubt for a moment that I had made a mistake. I turned to the door, intent upon relieving her of my presence as quickly as possible, when she said with the most exquisite courtesy, "In order to show you that I do not doubt your good faith, and that I am not at all offended, I beg that you will call upon me again, intentionally." 3 days passed before I got up sufficient courage to accept her invitation. Yes, I was madly in love with her. Accustomed as I am to analyze my own sensations, I knew that my passion could only end in the greatest happiness or the deepest suffering. However, at the end of the 3 days, I went to her apartment and spent the evening there. She told me that her name was Blanca, that she was born in Madrid, and that she was a widow. She played and sang for me, and asked me 1,000 questions about myself, my profession, my family, and every word she said increased my love for her. From that night my soul was the slave of her soul. Yes, and it will be forever. I called on her again the following night, and thereafter every afternoon and evening I was with her. We loved each other, but not a word of love had ever been spoken between us. One evening she said to me, "I married a man without loving him. Shortly after marriage I hated him. Now he is dead. Only God knows what I suffered. Now I understand what love means. It is either heaven or it is hell. For me, up to the present time, it has been hell." I could not sleep that night. I lay awake thinking over these last words of Blanca's. Somehow this woman frightened me. Would I be her heaven and she my hell? My leave of absence expired. I could have asked for an extension, pretending illness, but the question was, should I do it? I consulted Blanca. "Why do you ask me?" she said, taking my hand. "Because I love you. Am I doing wrong in loving you?" "No," she said, becoming very pale, and then she put both arms about my neck, and her beautiful lips touched mine. "Well, I asked for another month, and thanks to you, dear friend, it was granted. Never would they have given it to me without your influence. My relations with Blanca were more than love. They were delirium, madness, fanaticism, call it what you will. Every day my passion for her increased, and the morrow seemed to open up vistas of new happiness, and yet I could not avoid feeling at times a mysterious, indefinable fear, and this I knew she felt as well as I did. We both feared to lose one another. One day I said to Blanca, 'We must marry as quickly as possible.' She gave me a strange look. 'You wish to marry me?' 'Yes, Blanca,' I said. 'I am proud of you. I want to show you the whole world. I love you and I want you, pure, noble and saintly as you are.' 'I cannot marry you,' answered this incomprehensible woman. She would never give a reason. Finally my leave of absence expired, and I told her that on the following day we must separate. 'Separate? It is impossible!' she exclaimed. 'I love you too much for that.' 'But you know, Blanca, that I worship you.' 'Then give up your profession. I am rich. We will live our lives out together,' she said, putting her soft hand over my mouth to prevent my answer. I kissed the hand, and then, gently removing it, I answered, 'I would accept this offer from my wife, although it would be a sacrifice for me to give up my career, but I will not accept it from a woman who refuses to marry me.' Blanca remained thoughtful for several minutes. Then, raising her head, she looked at me and said very quietly, but with a determination which could not be misunderstood, 'I will be your wife, and I do not ask you to give up your profession. Go back to your office. How long will it take you to arrange your business matters and secure from the government another leave of absence to return to Sevilla?' 'A month.' 'A month? Well, here I will await you. Return within a month, and I will be your wife. Today is the 15th of April. You will be here on the 15th of May? You may rest assured of that. You swear it?' 'I swear it.' 'You love me?' 'More than my life.' 'Go then, and return. Farewell.' I left on the same day. The moment I arrived home, I began to arrange my house to receive my bride. As you know, I solicited another leave of absence, and so quickly did I arrange my business affairs that at the end of 2 weeks I was ready to return to Sevilla. I must tell you that during this fortnight I did not receive a single letter from Blanca, though I wrote her 6. I started at once for Sevilla, arriving in that city on the 30th of April, and went at once to the hotel where we had first met. I learned that Blanca had left there 2 days after my departure, without telling anyone her destination. Imagine my indignation, my disappointment, my suffering. She went away without even leaving a line for me, without telling me whither she was going. It never occurred to me to remain in Sevilla until the 15th of May, to ascertain whether she would return on that date. 3 days later I took up my court work and strove to forget her. A few moments after my friend Sarko finished the story, we arrived at the cemetery. This is only a small plot of ground covered with a veritable forest of crosses and surrounded by a low stone wall. As often happens in Spain, when the cemeteries are very small, it is necessary to dig up one coffin in order to lower another. Those thus disinterred are thrown in a heap in a corner of the cemetery, where skulls and bones are piled up like a haystack. As we were passing, Sarko and I looked at the skulls, wondering to whom they could have belonged, to rich or poor, noble or plebeian. Suddenly the judge bent down, and picking up a skull, exclaimed in astonishment, "Look here, my friend, what is this? It is surely a nail." Yes, a long nail had been driven in the top of the skull which he held in his hand. The nail had been driven into the head, and the point had penetrated what had been the roof of the mouth. What could this mean? He began to conjecture, and soon both of us felt filled with horror. "I recognize the hand of Providence," exclaimed the judge. "A terrible crime has evidently been committed, and would never have come to light had it not been for this accident. I shall do my duty, and will not rest until I have brought the assassin to the scaffold." 3. My friend Sarko was one of the keenest criminal judges in Spain. Within a very few days he discovered that the corpse to which this skull belonged had been buried in a rough wooden coffin which the gravedigger had taken home with him, intending to use it for firewood. Fortunately the man had not yet burned it up, and on the lid the judge managed to decipher the initials A.G.R. together with the date of interment. He had at once searched the parochial books of every church in the neighborhood, and a week later found the following entry: In the parochial church of San Sebastian of the village of, on the 4th of May, 1843, the funeral rites as prescribed by our holy religion were performed over the body of Don Alfonso Gutierrez Romeral, and he was buried in the cemetery. He was a native of this village, and did not receive the holy sacrament, nor did he confess, for he died suddenly of apoplexy at the age of 31. He was married to Doña Gabriela Sahara del Valle, a native of Madrid, and left no issue him surviving. The judge handed me the above certificate, duly certified to by the parish priest, and exclaimed, "Now everything is as clear as day, and I am positive that within a week the assassin will be arrested. The apoplexy in this case happens to be an iron nail driven into the man's head, which brought quick and sudden death to A.G.R. I have the nail, and I shall soon find the hammer." According to the testimony of the neighbors, Señor Romeral was a young and rich landowner, who originally came from Madrid, where he had married a beautiful wife. 4 months before the death of the husband, his wife had gone to Madrid to pass a few months with her family. The young woman returned home about the last day of April, that is, about 3 months and a half after she had left her husband's residence to go to Madrid. The death of Señor Romeral occurred about a week after her return. The shock caused to the widow by the sudden death of her husband was so great that she became ill and informed her friends that she could not continue to live in the same place where everything recalled to her the man she had lost, and just before the middle of May she had left for Madrid, 10 or 12 days after the death of her husband. The servants of the deceased had testified that the couple did not live amicably together and had frequent quarrels; that the absence of 3 months and a half which preceded the last 8 days the couple had lived together was practically an understanding that they were to be ultimately separated on account of mysterious disagreements which had existed between them from the date of their marriage; that on the date of the death of the deceased both husband and wife were together in the former's bedroom; that at midnight the bell was rung violently and they heard the cries of the wife; that they rushed to the room and were met at the door by the wife, who was very pale and greatly perturbed, and she cried out, "An apoplexy! Run for a doctor! My poor husband is dying!" That when they entered the room they found their master lying upon a couch, and he was dead. The doctor who was called certified that Señor Romeral had died of cerebral congestion. 3 medical experts testified that death brought about as this one had been could not be distinguished from apoplexy. The physician who had been called in had not thought to look for the head of the nail, which was concealed by the hair of the victim, nor was he in any sense to blame for this oversight. The judge immediately issued a warrant for the arrest of Doña Gabriela Sahara del Valle, widow of Señor Romeral. "Tell me," I asked the judge one day, "do you think you will ever capture this woman?" "I'm positive of it." "Why?" "Because in the midst of all these routine criminal affairs, there occurs now and then what may be termed a dramatic fatality which never fails. To put it in another way, when the bones come out of the tomb to testify, there is very little left for the judge to do." In spite of the hopes of my friend, Gabriela was not found, and 3 months later she was, according to the laws of Spain, tried, found guilty, and condemned to death in her absence. I returned home, not without promising to be with Sarko the following year. End of section 22. Section 23 of Library of the World's Best Mystery and Detective Stories, Volume 4. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Karen Savage. Library of the World's Best Mystery and Detective Stories, Volume 4, by Julian Hawthorne, Editor. Section 23. The Nail, by Pedro de Alarcón, Part 2. 4. That winter I passed in Granada. One evening I had been invited to a great ball given by a prominent Spanish lady. As I was mounting the stairs of the magnificent residence, I was startled by the sight of a face which was easily distinguishable even in this crowd of southern beauties. It was she, my unknown, the mysterious woman of the stagecoach, in fact, number 1, of whom I spoke at the beginning of this narrative. I made my way toward her, extending my hand in greeting. She recognized me at once. "Señora," I said, "I have kept my promise not to search for you. I did not know I would meet you here. Had I suspected it, I would have refrained from coming, for fear of annoying you. Now that I am here, tell me whether I may recognize you and talk to you." I see that you are vindictive," she answered graciously, putting her little hand in mine. "But I forgive you. How are you?" "In truth, I don't know. My health, that is, the health of my soul, for you would not ask me about anything else in a ballroom, depends upon the health of yours. What I mean is that I could only be happy if you are happy. May I ask if that wound of the heart which you told me about when I met you in the stagecoach has healed? You know as well as I do that there are wounds which never heal." With a graceful bow she turned away to speak to an acquaintance, and I asked a friend of mine who was passing, "Can you tell me who that woman is?" "A South American, whose name is Mercedes de Meridanueva." On the following day I paid a visit to the lady, who was residing at that time at the Hotel of the Seven Planets. The charming Mercedes received me as if I were an intimate friend, and invited me to walk with her through the wonderful Alhambra, and subsequently to dine with her. During the 6 hours we were together, she spoke of many things, and as we always returned to the subject of disappointed love, I felt impelled to tell her the experience of my friend, Judge Sarko. She listened to me very attentively, and when I concluded, she laughed and said, "Let this be a lesson to you not to fall in love with women whom you do not know." "Do not think for a moment," I answered, "that I have invented this story." "Oh, I don't doubt the truth of it. Perhaps there may be a mysterious woman in the Hotel of the Seven Planets of Granada, and perhaps she doesn't resemble the one your friend fell in love with in Sevilla. So far as I am concerned, there is no risk of my falling in love with anyone, for I never speak 3 times to the same man." "Señora, that is the equivalent to telling me that you refuse to see me again." "No. I only wish to inform you that I leave Granada tomorrow, and it is probable that we will never meet again." "Never? You told me that during our memorable ride in the stagecoach, and you see that you are not a good prophet." I noticed that she had become very pale. She rose from the table abruptly, saying, "Well, let us leave that to fate. For my part, I repeat that I am bidding you an eternal farewell." She said these last words very solemnly, and then, with a graceful bow, turned and ascended the stairway which led to the upper story of the hotel. I confess that I was somewhat annoyed at the disdainful way in which she seemed to have terminated our acquaintance, yet this feeling was lost in the pity I felt for her when I noted her expression of suffering. We had met for the last time. Would to God that it had been for the last time. Man proposes, but God disposes. 5. A few days later, business affairs brought me to the town wherein resided my friend Judge Sarko. I found him as lonely and as sad as at the time of my last visit. He had been able to find out nothing about Blanca, but he could not forget her for a moment. Unquestionably this woman was his fate, his heaven or his hell, as the unfortunate man was accustomed to saying. We were soon to learn that his judicial superstition was to be fully justified. The evening of the day of my arrival, we were seated in his office, reading the last reports of the police, who had been vainly attempting to trace Gabriela, when an officer entered and handed the judge a note, which read as follows: "In the Hotel of the Lion there is a lady who wishes to speak to Judge Sarko." "Who brought this?" asked the judge. "A servant." "Who sent him?" "He gave no name." The judge looked thoughtfully at the smoke of his cigar for a few moments, and then said, "A woman? To see me? I don't know why, but this thing frightens me. What do you think of it, Philip?" "That it is your duty as a judge to answer the call, of course. Perhaps she may be able to give you some information in regard to Gabriela." "You are right," answered Sarko, rising. He put a revolver in his pocket, threw his cloak over his shoulders, and went out. 2 hours later he returned. I saw at once by his face that some great happiness must have come to him. He put his arms about me and embraced me convulsively, exclaiming, "Oh, dear friend, if you only knew! If you only knew!" "But I don't know anything," I answered. "What on earth has happened to you?" "I'm simply the happiest man in the world." "But what is it?" "The note that called me to the hotel was from her." "But from whom? From Gabriela Zahara?" "Oh, stop such nonsense! Who is thinking of those things now? It was she, I tell you, the other one." "In the name of heaven, be calm and tell me whom you are talking about." "Who could it be but Blanca, my love, my life?" "Blanca?" I answered with astonishment. "But the woman deceived you." "Oh no, that was all a foolish mistake on my part." "Explain yourself." "Listen. Blanca adores me." "Oh, you think she does?" "Well, go on." "When Blanca and I separated on the 15th of April, it was understood that we were to meet again on the 15th of May. Shortly after I left, she received a letter calling her to Madrid on urgent family business, and she did not expect me back until the 15th of May, so she remained in Madrid until the 1st. But as you know, I, in my impatience, could not wait, and returned 15 days before I had agreed, and not finding her at the hotel, I jumped to the conclusion that she had deceived me, and I did not wait. I have gone through 2 years of torment and suffering, all due to my own stupidity. But she could have written you a letter. She said that she had forgotten the address. Ah, my poor friend, I exclaimed, I see that you are striving to convince yourself. Well, so much the better. Now, when does the marriage take place? I suppose that after so long and dark a night, the sun of matrimony will rise radiant. Don't laugh, exclaimed Sarko. You shall be my best man. With much pleasure. Man proposes, but God disposes. We were still seated in the library chatting together, when there came a knock at the door. It was about 2 o'clock in the morning. The judge and I were both startled, but we could not have told why. The servant opened the door, and a moment later a man dashed into the library so breathless from hard running that he could scarcely speak. "Good news, Judge, grand news," he said when he recovered breath. "We have won!" The man was the prosecuting attorney. "Explain yourself, my dear friend," said the judge, motioning him to a chair. "What remarkable occurrence could have brought you hither in such haste, and at this hour of the morning?" "We have arrested Gabriela Sahara." "Arrested her?" exclaimed the judge joyfully. "Yes, sir, we have her. One of our detectives has been following her for a month. He has caught her, and she is now locked up in a cell of the prison." "Then let us go there at once," exclaimed the judge. "We will interrogate her tonight. Do me the favor to notify my secretary. Owing to the gravity of the case, you yourself must be present. Also notify the guard who has charge of the head of Señor Romeral. It has been my opinion from the beginning that this criminal woman would not dare deny the horrible murder when she was confronted with the evidence of her crime. And so far as you are concerned," said the judge, turning to me, "I will appoint you assistant secretary, so that you can be present without violating the law." I did not answer. A horrible suspicion had been growing within me, a suspicion which, like some infernal animal, was tearing at my heart with claws of steel. Could Gabriela and Blanca be one and the same? I turned to the assistant district attorney. "By the way," I asked, "where was Gabriela when she was arrested?" "In the Hotel of the Lion." My suffering was frightful, but I could say nothing, do nothing, without compromising the judge. Besides, I was not sure. Even if I were positive that Gabriela and Blanca were the same person, what could my unfortunate friend do? Feign a sudden illness? Flee the country? My only way was to keep silent, and let God work it out in his own way. The orders of the judge had already been communicated to the chief of police and the warden of the prison. Even at this hour the news had spread throughout the city, and idlers were gathering to see the rich and beautiful woman who would ascend the scaffold. I still clung to the slender hope that Gabriela and Blanca were not the same person. But when I went toward the prison, I staggered like a drunken man, and was compelled to lean upon the shoulder of one of the officials, who asked me anxiously if I were ill. 6. We arrived at the prison at 4 o'clock in the morning. The large reception room was brilliantly lighted. The guard, holding a black box in which was the skull of Señor Romeral, was awaiting us. The judge took his seat at the head of the long table, the prosecuting attorney sat on his right, and the chief of police stood by with arms folded. I and the secretary sat on the left of the judge. A number of police officers and detectives were standing near the door. The judge touched his bell and said to the warden, "Bring in Doña Gabriela Sahara." I felt as if I were dying, and instead of looking at the door, I looked at the judge to see if I could read in his face the solution of this frightful problem. I saw him turn livid and clutch his throat with both hands, as if to stop a cry of agony, and then he turned to me with a look of infinite supplication. "Keep quiet," I whispered, putting my finger on my lips, and then I added, "I knew it." The unfortunate man arose from his chair. "Judge!" I exclaimed, and in that one word I conveyed to him the full sense of his duty and of the dangers which surrounded him. He controlled himself and resumed his seat, but were it not for the light in his eyes, he might have been taken for a dead man. Yes, the man was dead, only the judge lived. When I had convinced myself of this, I turned and looked at the accused. Good God! Gabriela Sahara was not only Blanca, the woman my friend so deeply loved, but she was also the woman I had met in the stagecoach and subsequently at Granada, the beautiful South American Mercedes. All these fantastic women had now merged into one, the real one who stood before us, accused of the murder of her husband and who had been condemned to die. There was still a chance to prove herself innocent. Could she do it? This was my one supreme hope, as it was that of my poor friend. Gabriela, we will call her now by her real name, was deathly pale, but apparently calm. Was she trusting to her innocence or to the weakness of the judge? Our doubts were soon solved. Up to that moment the accused had looked at no one but the judge. I did not know whether she desired to encourage him or menace him, or to tell him that his Blanca could not be an assassin. But noting the impassibility of the magistrate, and that his face was as expressionless as that of a corpse, she turned to the others, as if seeking help from them. Then her eyes fell upon me, and she blushed slightly. The judge now seemed to awaken from his stupor, and asked in a harsh voice, "What is your name?" "Gabriela Sara, widow of Romeral," answered the accused in a soft voice. Sarko trembled. He had just learned that his Blanca had never existed. She told him so herself, she who only 3 hours before had consented to become his wife. Fortunately no one was looking at the judge, all eyes being fixed upon Gabriela, whose marvelous beauty and quiet demeanor carried to all an almost irresistible conviction of her innocence. The judge recovered himself, and then, like a man who is staking more than life upon the cast of a die, he ordered the guard to open the black box. "Madam," said the judge sternly, his eyes seeming to dart flames, "approach and tell me whether you recognize this head." At a signal from the judge, the guard opened the black box and lifted out the skull. A cry of mortal agony rang through that room. One could not tell whether it was of fear or of madness. The woman shrank back, her eyes dilating with terror, and screamed, "Alfonso! Alfonso!" Then she seemed to fall into a stupor. All turned to the judge, murmuring, "She is guilty beyond a doubt." "Do you recognize the nail which deprived your husband of life?" said the judge, arising from his chair, looking like a corpse rising from the grave. "Yes, sir," answered Gabriela mechanically. "That is to say, you admit that you assassinated your husband?" asked the judge in a voice that trembled with his great suffering. "Sir," answered the accused, "I do not care to live any more. But before I die, I would like to make a statement." The judge fell back in his chair, and then asked me by a look, "What is she going to say?" I myself was almost stupefied by fear. Gabriela stood before them, her hands clasped, and a faraway look in her large, dark eyes. "I am going to confess," she said, "and my confession will be my defense, although it will not be sufficient to save me from the scaffold. Listen to me, all of you. Why deny that which is self-evident? I was alone with my husband when he died. The servants and the doctor have testified to this. Hence, only I could have killed him. Yes, I committed the crime, but another man forced me to do it." The judge trembled when he heard these words, but dominating his emotion, he asked courageously, "The name of that man, madam? Tell us at once the name of the scoundrel." Gabriela looked at the judge with an expression of infinite love, as a mother would look at the child she worshipped, and answered, "By a single word I could drag this man into the depths with me, but I will not. No one shall ever know his name, for he has loved me, and I love him. Yes, I love him, although I know he will do nothing to save me." The judge half rose from his chair and extended his hands beseechingly, but she looked at him as if to say, "Be careful. You will betray yourself, and it will do no good." He sank back into his chair, and Gabriela continued her story in a quiet, firm voice. "I was forced to marry a man I hated. I hated him more after I married him than I did before. I lived 3 years in martyrdom. One day there came into my life a man whom I loved. He demanded that I should marry him. He asked me to fly with him to a heaven of happiness and love. He was a man of exceptional character, high and noble, whose only fault was that he loved me too much. Had I told him, 'I have deceived you, I am not a widow, my husband is living,' he would have left me at once. I invented 1,000 excuses, but he always answered, 'Be my wife.' What could I do? I was bound to a man of the vilest character and habits, whom I loathed. Well, I killed this man, believing that I was committing an act of justice, and God punished me, for my lover abandoned me. And now I am very, very tired of life, and all I ask of you is that death may come as quickly as possible." Gabriela stopped speaking. The judge had buried his face in his hands as if he were thinking, but I could see he was shaking like an epileptic. "Your Honor," repeated Gabriela, "grant my request that I may die soon." The judge made a sign to the guards to remove the prisoner. Before she followed them, she gave me a terrible look in which there was more of pride than of repentance. I do not wish to enter into details of the condition of the judge during the following day. In the great emotional struggle which took place, the officer of the law conquered the man, and he confirmed the sentence of death. On the following day the papers were sent to the Court of Appeals, and then Sarko came to me and said, "Wait here until I return. Take care of this unfortunate woman, but do not visit her, for your presence would humiliate instead of consoling her. Do not ask me whither I am going, and do not think that I am going to commit the very foolish act of taking my own life. Farewell, and forgive me all the worry I have caused you." 20 days later, the Court of Appeals confirmed the sentence, and Gabriela Zahara was placed in the death cell. The morning of the day fixed for the execution came, and still the judge had not returned. The scaffold had been erected in the center of the square, and an enormous crowd had gathered. I stood by the door of the prison, for while I had obeyed the wish of my friend that I should not call on Gabriela in her prison, I believed it my duty to represent him in that supreme moment, and accompany the woman he had loved to the foot of the scaffold. When she appeared surrounded by her guards, I hardly recognized her. She had grown very thin, and seemed hardly to have the strength to lift to her lips the small crucifix she carried in her hand. "I am here, Señora. Can I be of service to you?" I asked her as she passed by me. She raised her deep, sunken eyes to mine, and when she recognized me, she exclaimed, "Oh, thanks, thanks. This is a great consolation for me in my last hour of life. Father," she added, turning to the priest who stood beside her, "may I speak a few words to this generous friend?" "Yes, my daughter," answered the venerable minister. Then Gabriela asked me, "Where is he?" "He is absent. May God bless him and make him happy. When you see him, ask him to forgive me, even as I believe God has already forgiven me. Tell him I love him yet, although this love is the cause of my death." We had arrived at the foot of the scaffold stairway, where I was compelled to leave her. A tear, perhaps the last one there was in that suffering heart, rolled down her cheek. Once more she said, "Tell him that I died blessing him." Suddenly there came a roar like that of thunder. The mass of people swayed, shouted, danced, laughed like maniacs, and above all this tumult, one word rang out clearly: "Pardoned! Pardoned!" At the entrance to the square appeared a man on horseback, galloping madly toward the scaffold. In his hand he waved a white handkerchief, and his voice rang high above the clamor of the crowd: "Pardoned! Pardoned!" It was the judge. Reining up his foaming horse at the foot of the scaffold, he extended a paper to the chief of police. Gabriela, who had already mounted some of the steps, turned and gave the judge a look of infinite love and gratitude. "God bless you!" she exclaimed, and then fell senseless. As soon as the signatures and seals upon the document had been verified by the authorities, the priest and the judge rushed to the accused to undo the cords which bound her hands and arms, and to revive her. All their efforts were useless, however. Gabriela Zahara was dead. End of section 23.
Section 24 of Library of World's Best Mystery and Detective Stories, Volume 4. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Xanderphillips. Library of the World's Best Mystery and Detective Stories, Volume 4, by Julian Hawthorne, Editor. Section 24, The Deposition, by Luigi Capuana.
"I know nothing at all about it, Your Honor."
Nothing at all. How can that be? It all happened within 50 yards of your shop.
"Nothing at all. I said in an offhand way, but really next to nothing. I'm a barber, Your Honor, and heaven be praised I have custom enough to keep me busy from morning till night. There are 3 of us in the shop, and what with shaving and combing and hair-cutting, not one of the 3 of us has time to stop and scratch his head, and I least of all. Many of my customers are so kind as to prefer my services to those of my 2 young men, perhaps because I amuse them with my little jokes, and what with lathering and shaving this face and that, combing the hair of so many heads, How does your honor expect me to pay attention to other people's affairs? And the morning I read about it in the paper, why, I stood there with my mouth open and I said, well, that was the way it was bound to end.
Why did you say that was the way it was bound to end?
Why, because it had ended that way, you see. On the instant, I called to mind the ugly face of the husband. Every time I saw him pass up or down the street, one of those impressions that no one can account for, I used to think, that fellow has the face of a convict. But of course that proves nothing. There are plenty who have the bad luck to be uglier than mortal sin, but very worthy people all the same. But in this case I didn't think that I was mistaken.
But you were friends. He used to come very often and sit down at the entrance to your barber shop.
Very often? Only once in a while, your honor. By your leave, neighbor, he would say. He always called me neighbor. That was his name for everybody. And I would say, why, certainly. The chair stood there empty. Your honor understands that I could hardly be so uncivil as to say to him, no, you can't sit down. A barber shop is a public place, like a cafe or a beer saloon. At all events, one may sit down without paying for it, and no need to have a shave or a haircut either. By your leave, neighbor, and there he would sit in silence, smoking and scowling with his eyes half shut. He would loaf there for half an hour, sometimes longer. He annoyed me, I don't deny it, from the very start. There was a good deal of talk.
What sort of talk?
A good deal of talk. Your honor knows better than I how evil-minded people are. I make it a practice not to believe a syllable of what I'm told about anyone, good or evil. That is the way to keep out of trouble.
Come, what sort of talk? Keep to the point.
What sort of talk? Why, one day they would say this, and the next day they would say that, and by harping on it long enough, they made themselves believe that the wife, well, your honor knows that a pretty wife is a chastisement of God, and after all, there are some things you can't help seeing unless you won't see.
Then it was he, the husband?
I don't know nothing about it, your honor, nothing at all. But it is quite true that every time he came and sat down by my doorway or inside the shop, I used to say to myself, if that man can't see, he certainly must be blind. And if he won't see, he certainly must be. Your honor knows what I mean. There was certainly no getting out of that. Perhaps your honor can help me to the right word.
Dilemma?
Dilemma, yes, your honor. And Basie, the notary who comes to me to be shaved, uses another word that just fits the case, begging your honor's pardon.
Then, according to you, this Don Nicasio...
Oh, I won't put my finger in the pie. Let him answer for himself. Everyone has a conscience of his own, and Jesus Christ has said, judge not, lest ye be judged. Well, one morning, or was it in the evening? I don't exactly remember. Yes, now it comes back to me that it was in the morning. I saw him pass by, scowling and with his head bent down. I was in my doorway sharpening a razor. Out of curiosity, I gave him a passing word, as well as a nod, adding a gesture that was as good as a question. He came up to me, looked me straight in the face, and answered, haven't I told you that sooner or later I should do something crazy? And I shall, neighbor. Yes, I shall. They are dragging me by the hair. Let me cut it off, then, I answered jokingly, to make him forget himself.
So he had told you before, had he? How did he happen to tell you before?
Oh, your honor knows how words slip out of the mouth at certain moments. Who pays attention to 'em? For my part, I have too many other things in my head.
Come. What had he been talking about when he told you before?
Great heavens, give me time to think, your honor. What had he been talking about? Why, about his wife, of course. Who knows? Someone must have put a flea in his ear. It only needs a half a word to ruin a poor devil's peace of mind. And that is how a man lets such words slip out of his mouth as, sooner or later I shall do something crazy. That's all. I know nothing else about it, Your Honor.
And the only answer you made him was a joke.
I could not say to him, go ahead and do it, could I? As it was, he went off, shaking his head. And what idea he kept brooding over after that, who knows? One can't see inside another man's brain. But sometimes, when I heard him freeing his mind...
Then he used to free his mind to you?
Why, yes, to me, and maybe to others besides. You see, one bears things, and bears things, and bears things, and at last, rather than burst with them, one frees one's mind to the first man who comes along.
But you were not the first man who came along. You used to call at his house.
Only as a barber, Your Honor. Only when Don Nicasio used to send for me. And very often I'd get there too late, though I tried my best.
And very likely you sometimes went there when you knew that he was not at home?
On purpose, Your Honor? No, never.
And when you found his wife alone, you allowed yourself...
Calumnies, Your Honor. Who dares say such a thing? Does she say so? It may be that once or twice a few words escaped me in jest. You know how it is. When I found myself face to face with a pretty woman, you know how it is. If only not to cut a foolish figure.
But it was very far from a joke. You ended by threatening her.
What calumnies? Threaten her? What for? A woman of her stamp don't need to be threatened. I would never stoop so low. I'm no schoolboy.
Passion leads men into all sorts of folly.
That woman is capable of anything. She would slander our Lord himself to his face. Passion? I, at my age? I'm well on in the 40s, Your Honor, and many a gray hair besides. Many a folly I committed in my youth like everyone else. But now, besides, with a woman like that, I was no blind man, even if Don Nicasio was. I knew that young fella, poor fool, he paid dearly for her. I knew that he had turned her head. That's the way with some women. They go their own gait. They're off with one and on with another. And then they end by becoming the slave of some scallywag who robs and abuses them. He used to beat her, Your Honor, many and many a time, Your Honor. And I, for the sake of the poor husband whom I pitied. Yes, that's why she says I threatened her. She says so because I was foolish enough to go and give her a talking to the day that Don Nicasio said to me, I shall do something crazy. She knew what I meant. At least she pretended that she did.
No, this is what you said.
Yes, Your Honor, I remember now exactly what I said. I'll spoil your sport, I told her, if it sends me to the galleys. But I was speaking in the name of the husband. In the heat of the moment one falls into a pot.
The husband knew nothing of all this.
Was I to boast to him of what I had done? A friend either gives his services, or else he doesn't. That's how I understand it.
Why were you so much concerned about it?
I ought not to have been, Your Honor. I have too soft a heart.
Your threats became troublesome. And not threats alone, but promise after promise. And gifts besides. A ring and a pair of earrings.
That is true. I won't deny it. I found them in my pocket, quite by chance. They belonged to my wife. It wasn't extravagance, but I did it. To keep poor Don Nicasio from doing something crazy. If I could only win my point, I told myself. If I could only get that young fellow out of the way, then it would be time enough to say to Don Nicasio, my friend, give me back my ring and earrings. He would not have needed to be told twice. He's an honorable man, Don Nicasio.
But when she answered you, keep them yourself, I don't want them, you began to beg her, almost in tears.
Ah, Your Honor, since you must be told, I don't know how I managed to control myself. I had so completely put myself in the place of the husband. I could have strangled her with my own hands. I could have done that very same crazy thing that Don Nicasio thought of doing.
Yet you were very prudent, that is evident. You said to yourself, if not for me, then not for him. The lover, I mean, not Don Nicasio. Then you began to work upon the husband, who, up to that time, had let things slide, either because he did not believe, or because he preferred to bear the lesser evil.
It may be that some chance word escaped me. There are times when a man of honor loses his head, but beyond that, nothing, your honor. Don Nicasio himself will bear me witness.
But Don Nicasio says...
He too? He has failed me? He has turned against me? A fine way to show his gratitude.
He has nothing to be grateful for. Don't excite yourself. Sit down again. You began by protesting that you knew nothing at all about it, and yet you knew so many things. You must know quite a number more. Don't excite yourself.
You want to drag me over a precipice, your honor. I begin to understand.
Men who are blinded by passion walk over precipices on their own feet.
But then your honor imagines that I, myself...
I imagine nothing. It is evident that you were the instigator, and something more than the instigator, too.
County, your honor.
That same evening you were seen talking with the husband until quite late.
I was trying to persuade him not to. I said to him, let things alone. Since it's your misfortune to have it so, what difference does it make whether he's the one or somebody else? And he kept repeating, somebody else, yes, but not that rotten beast. His very words, your honor.
You stood at the corner of the adjoining street, lying in wait.
Who saw me there? Who saw us, your honor?
You were seen. Come, make up your mind to tell all you know. It will be better for you. The woman testifies there were two of them, but in the dark she could not recognize the other one.
Just because I wanted to do a kind act. This is what I have brought on myself by trying to do a kind act.
You stood at the street corner.
It was like this, your honor. I had gone with him as far as that, but when I saw it was no use to try to stop him, it was striking 11. The streets were deserted. I started to leave him indignantly, without a parting word.
Well, what next? Do I need tongs to drag the words out of your mouth?
What next? Why, your honor knows how it is at night, under the lamplight. You see, then you don't see. That's the way it is. I turned around. Don Nicasio had plunged through the doorway of his home, just by the entrance to the little lane. A cry, and then nothing more.
You ran forward? That was quite natural.
I hesitated on the threshold. The hallway was so dark.
You couldn't have done that. The woman would have recognized you by the light of the street lamp.
The lamp is some distance off.
You went in one after the other. Which of you shut the door? Because the door was shut immediately.
In the confusion of the moment, two men struggling together, I could hear them gasping. I wanted to call for help. And then a fall. And then I felt myself seized by the arm. Run, neighbor, run. This is no business of yours. It didn't sound like the voice of a human being. And that was how I happened to be there, a helpless witness. I think that Don Nicasio meant to kill his wife, too, but the wretched woman escaped. She ran and shut herself up in her room. That is, I read so afterwards in the papers. The husband would have been wiser to have killed her first. Evil weeds have better to be torn up by the roots. What are you having that man write, your honor?
Nothing at all, as you call it. Just your deposition. The clerk will read it to you now, and you will sign it.
Can any harm come to me from it? I'm innocent. I've only said what you wanted me to say. You have tangled me up in a fine net like a little freshwater fish.
Wait a moment. And this is the most important thing of all. How did it happen that the mortal wounds on the dead man's body were made with a razor?
Oh, the treachery of Don Nicasio. My God, my God! Yes, your honor. 2 days before. No one can think of everything. No one can foresee everything. He came to the shop and said to me, "Neighbor, lend me a razor. I have a corn that is troubling me." He was so matter-of-fact about it that I did not hesitate for an instant. I even warned him, "Be careful, you can't joke with corns. A little blood, and you may start a cancer." "Don't borrow trouble, neighbor," he answered.
But the razor could not be found. You must have brought it away.
"I? Who would remember a little thing like that? I was more dead than alive, your honor. Where are you trying to lead me with your questions? I tell you, I'm innocent."
Do not deny so obstinately. A frank confession will help you far more than to protest your innocence. The facts speak clearly enough. It is well known how passion maddens the heart and the brain. A man in that state is no longer himself.
"That is the truth, your honor. That wretched woman bewitched me. She is sending me to the galleys. The more she said no, 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 the more I felt myself going mad, from head to foot, as if she were pouring fire over me with her no, no, no. But now I do not want another man to suffer in my place. Yes, I was the one. I was the one who killed him. I was bewitched, your honor. I am willing to go to the galleys, but I am coming back here if I have the good luck to live through my term. Oh, the justice of this world. To think that she goes scot-free, the real and only cause of all the harm. But I will see that she gets justice. That I solemnly swear. With these 2 hands of mine, your honor. In prison I shall think of nothing else. And if I come back and find her alive, grown old and ugly, it makes no difference. She will have to pay for it. She will have to make good. Ah, no, no, no. But I will say yes, yes, yes. And I will drain her last drop of blood if I have to end my days in the galleys. And the sooner, the better.
End of section 24. Recording by Xanderphillips.
Section 25 of Library of World's Best Mystery and Detective Stories, Volume 4. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Darvinia. Library of the World's Best Mystery and Detective Stories, Volume 4, by Julian Hawthorne, Editor. Section 25. The Adventure of the Three Robbers, by Lucius Apuleius. The great satire of Lucius Apuleius, the work through which his name lives after the lapse of nearly 18 centuries, is The Golden Ass, a romance from which the following passage has been selected and translated for these mystery stories. Lucius, the personage who tells the story, is regarded in some quarters as a portrayal of the author himself. The purpose of The Golden Ass was to satirize false priests and other contemporary frauds, but interspersed are many episodes of adventure and strange situations, one of which is here given. As Telephron reached the point of his story, his fellow revellers, befuddled with their wine, renewed the boisterous uproar. And while the old topers were clamouring for the customary libation to laughter, Verena explained to me that the morrow was a day religiously observed by her city from its cradle up, a day on which they alone among mortals propitiated that most sacred god, laughter, with hilarious and joyful rites. The fact that you are here, she added, will make it all the merrier, and I do wish that you would contribute something amusing out of your own cleverness in honour of the god, to help us duly worship such an important divinity. Surely, said I, what you ask shall be done, and by Jove, I hope I shall hit upon something good enough to make this mighty god of yours reveal his presence. Hereupon, my slave reminding me what hour of night it was, I speedily got upon my feet, although none too steadily after my potations, and having duly taken leave of Verena, guided my zigzag steps upon the homeward way. but at the very first corner we turned, a sudden gust of wind blew out the solitary torch on which we depended, and left us plunged in the unforeseen blackness of night to stumble wearily and painfully to our abode, bruising our feet on every stone in the road. But when at last, holding each other up, we drew near our goal, there ahead of us were three others, of big and brawny build, expending the full energy of their strength upon our doorposts. And far from being in the least dismayed by our arrival, they seemed only fired to a greater zeal, and made assault more fiercely. Quite naturally, it seemed clear to us both, and especially to me, that they were robbers, and of the most dangerous sort. So I forthwith drew the blade which I carry hidden under my cloak for such emergencies, and threw myself undismayed into the midst of these highwaymen. One after another, as they successively tried to withstand me, I ran them through, until finally all three lay stretched at my feet, riddled with many a gaping wound, through which they yielded up their breath. By this time Fotis the maid had been aroused by the din of battle, and still panting and perspiring freely, I slipped in through the opening door, and as weary as though I had fought with the three-formed Geryon instead of those pugnacious thieves, I yielded myself at one and the same moment to bed and to slumber. Soon rosy-fingered Dawn, shaking the purple reins, was guiding her steeds across the path of heaven, and snatched from my untroubled rest, night gave me back to day. Dismay seized my soul at the recollection of my deeds of the past evening. I sat there crouching on my bed, with my interlaced fingers hugging my knees, and freely gave way to my distress. I already saw in fancy the court, the jury, the verdict, the executioner. How could I hope to find any judge so mild, so benevolent as to pronounce me innocent, soiled as I was with a triple murder, stained with the blood of so many citizens? Was this the glorious climax of my travels that the Chaldean Diophanes had so confidently predicted for me? Again and again I went over the whole matter, bewailing my hard lot. Hereupon there came a pounding at our doors, and a steadily growing clamour on the threshold. No sooner was admission given than with an impetuous rush the whole house was filled with magistrates, police, and the motley crowd that followed. 2 officers, by order of the magistrates, promptly laid hands upon me and started to drag me off, though resistance was the last thing I should have thought of. By the time we had reached the first cross street, the entire city was already trailing at our heels in an astonishingly dense mass, and I marched gloomily along with my head hanging down to the very earth. I might even say to the lower regions below the earth. At length, after having made the circuit of every city square, in exactly the way that the victims are led around before a sacrifice meant to ward off evil omens, I was brought into the forum, and made to confront the tribunal of justice. The magistrates had taken their seats upon the raised platform. The court crier had commanded silence, when suddenly every one present, as if with one voice, protested that in so vast a gathering there was danger from the dense crowding, and demanded that a case of such importance should be tried, instead, in the public theatre. No sooner said than the entire populace streamed onward, helter-skelter, and in a marvellously short time had packed the whole auditorium till every aisle and gallery was one solid mass. Many swarmed up the columns, others dangled from the statues, while a few there were that perched, half out of sight, on window ledges and cornices. But all, in their amazing eagerness, seemed quite careless how far they risked their lives. After the manner of a sacrifice, I was led by the public officials down the middle of the stage, and was left standing in the midst of the orchestra. Once more the voice of the court crier boomed forth, calling for the prosecutor, whereupon a certain old man arose, and having first taken a small vase, the bottom of which ended in a narrow funnel, and having filled it with water, which escaping drop by drop should mark the length of his speech, addressed the populace as follows: This is no trivial case, most honoured citizens, but one which directly concerns the peace of our entire city, and one which will be handed down as a weighty precedent. Wherefore your individual and common interests equally demand that you should sustain the dignity of the state, and not permit this brutal murderer to escape the penalty of the wholesale butchery that resulted from his bloody deeds. And do not think that I am influenced by any private motives, or giving vent to personal animosity. For I am in command of the night watch, and up to this time I think there is no one who will question my watchful diligence. Accordingly, I will state the case and faithfully set forth the events of last night. It was about the hour of the third watch, and I was making my round of the entire city, going from door to door with scrupulous vigilance, when suddenly I beheld this bloodthirsty young man, sword in hand, spreading carnage around him. Already no less than 3 victims of his savagery lay writhing at his feet, gasping forth their breath in a pool of blood. Stricken, as well he might be, with the guilt of so great a crime, the fellow fled, and slipping into one of the houses under cover of the darkness, lay hidden the rest of the night. But, thanks to the gods who permit no sinner to go unpunished, I forestalled him at daybreak, before he could make his escape by secret ways, and have brought him here for trial before your sacred tribunal of justice. The prisoner at the bar is a 3-fold murderer. He was taken in the very act, and furthermore, he's a foreigner. Accordingly, it is your plain duty to return a verdict of guilty against this man from a strange land, for a crime which you would severely punish even in the case of one of your own citizens." Having thus spoken, the remorseless prosecutor suspended his vindictive utterance, and the court crier straightway ordered me to begin my defence, if I had any to make. At first I could not sufficiently control my voice to speak, although less overcome, alas, by the harshness of the accusation than by my own guilty conscience. But at last, miraculously inspired with courage, I made answer as follows: "I realize how hard it is for a man accused of murder, and confronted with the bodies of 3 of your citizens, to persuade so large a multitude of his innocence, even though he tells the exact truth and voluntarily admits the facts. But if in mercy you will give me an attentive hearing, I shall easily make clear to you that, far from deserving to be put on trial for my life, I have wrongfully incurred the heavy stigma of such a crime as the chance result of justifiable indignation. I was making my way home from a dinner party at a rather late hour, after drinking pretty freely, I won't attempt to deny, for that was the head and front of my offence, when lo and behold, before the very doors of my abode, before the home of the good Milo, your fellow citizen, I beheld a number of villainous thieves trying to effect an entrance, and already prying the doors off from the twisted hinges. All the locks and bolts, so carefully closed for the night, had been wrenched away, and the thieves were planning the slaughter of the inmates. Finally, one of them, bigger and more active than the rest, urged them to action with these words: "Come on, boys! Show the stuff you are made of, and strike for all you are worth while they are asleep. No quarter now, no faint-hearted weakening. Let death go through the house with drawn sword. If you find any in bed, slit their throats before they wake. If any try to resist, cut them down. Our only chance of getting away safe and sound is to leave no one else safe and sound in the whole house." I confess, citizens, that I was badly frightened, both on account of my hosts and myself, and believing that I was doing the duty of a good citizen, I drew the sword which always accompanies me in readiness for such dangers, and started in to drive away or lay low those desperate robbers. But the barbarous and inhuman villains, far from being frightened away, had the audacity to stand against me, although they saw that I was armed. Their serried ranks opposed me. Next, the leader and standard-bearer of the band, assailing me with brawny strength, seized me with both hands by the hair, and bending me backward, prepared to beat out my brains with a paving-stone. but while he was still shouting for one, with an unerring stroke I luckily ran him through and stretched him at my feet. Before long a second stroke, aimed between the shoulders, finished off another of them, as he clung tooth and nail to my legs, while the third one, as he rashly advanced, I stabbed full in the chest. Since I had fought on the side of law and order, in defence of public safety and my host's home, I felt myself not only without blame, but deserving of public praise. I have never before been charged with even the slightest infringement of the law. I enjoy a high reputation among my own people, and all my life have valued a clear conscience above all material possessions. Nor can I understand why I should suffer this prosecution for having taken a just vengeance upon those worthless thieves, since no one can show that there had ever before been any enmity between us, or for that matter that I had ever had any previous acquaintance with the thieves. You have not even established any motive for which I may be supposed to have committed so great a crime." At this point my emotion again overcame me, and with my hands extended in entreaty I turned from one to another, beseeching them to spare me in the name of common humanity, for the sake of all that they held dear. I thought by this time they must be moved to pity, thrilled with sympathy for my wretchedness. Accordingly I called to witness the eye of justice and the light of day, and entrusted my case to the providence of God. When lifting up my eyes, I discovered that the whole assembly was convulsed with laughter, not excepting my own kind host and relative, Milo, who was shaking with merriment. So much for friendship, I thought to myself, so much for gratitude. In protecting my host I've become a murderer, on trial for my life, while he, far from raising a finger to help me, makes a mock of my misery. At this moment a woman clad in black rushed down the centre of the stage, weeping and wailing, and clasping a small child to her breast. An older woman, covered with rags and similarly shaken with sobs, followed her, both of them waving olive branches as they passed around the bier on which lay the covered bodies of the slain, and lifted up their voices in mournful outcry. "For the sake of common humanity," they wailed, "by all the universal laws of justice, be moved to pity by the undeserved death of these young men. Give to a lonely wife and mother the comfort of vengeance. Come to the aid of this unhappy child left fatherless in his tender years, and offer up the blood of the assassin at the shrine of law and order." Hereupon the presiding magistrate arose and addressed the people. "The crime for which the prisoner will later pay the full penalty, not even he attempts to deny. But still another duty remains to be performed, and that is to find out who were his accomplices in this wicked deed, since it does not seem likely that one man alone could have overcome 3 others so young and strong as these. We must apply torture to extract the truth, and since the slave who accompanied him has made his escape, there is no other alternative left us than to wring the names of his companions from the prisoner himself, in order that we may effectually relieve the public of all apprehension of danger from this desperate gang." Immediately, in accordance with the Greek usage, fire and the wheel were brought forth, together with all the other instruments of torture. Now indeed my distress was not only increased, but multiplied when I saw that I was fated to perish piecemeal. At this point the old woman, whose noisy lamentations had become a nuisance, broke out with this demand: "Honoured citizens, before you proceed to torture the prisoner, on account of the dear ones whom he has taken from me, will you not permit the bodies of the deceased to be uncovered, in order that the sight of their youth and beauty may fire you with a righteous anger, and a severity proportioned to the crime?" These words were received with applause, and straightway the magistrate commanded that I myself should with my own hand draw off the covering from the bodies lying on the bier. In spite of my struggles, and desperate determination not to look again upon the consequences of my last night's deed, the court attendants promptly dragged me forward, in obedience to the judge's order, and bending my arm by main force from its place at my side, stretched it out above the 3 corpses. Conquered in the struggle, I yielded to necessity, and much against my will drew down the covering and exposed the bodies. Great heavens, what a sight! What a miracle! What a transformation in my whole destiny! I had already begun to look upon myself as a vassal of Proserpine, a bondsman of Hades, and now I could only gasp in impotent amazement at the suddenness of the change. Words fail me to express fittingly the astounding metamorphosis, for the bodies of my butchered victims were nothing more nor less than 3 inflated bladders, whose sides still bore the scars of numerous punctures, which, as I recalled my battle of the previous night, were situated at the very points where I had inflicted gaping wounds upon my adversaries. Hereupon the hilarity, which up to this point had been fairly held in check, swept through the crowd like a conflagration. Some gave themselves up helplessly to an unrestrained extravagance of merriment. Others did their best to control themselves, holding their aching sides with both hands. And having all laughed until they could laugh no more, they passed out of the theatre, their backward glances still centred upon me. From the moment that I had drawn down that funeral pall, I stood fixed, as if frozen into stone, as powerless to move as any one of the theatre's statues or columns. Nor did I come out of my stupor until Milo, my host, himself approached, and clapping me on the shoulder, drew me away with gentle violence, my tears now flowing freely and sobs choking my voice. He led me back to the house by a roundabout way through the least frequented streets, doing his best meanwhile to soothe my nerves and heal my wounded feelings. But nothing he could say availed to lessen my bitter indignation at having been made so undeservedly ridiculous. But all at once the magistrates themselves, still wearing their insignia of office, arrived at the house and made personal amends in the following words: "We are well aware, Master Lucius, both of your own high merit and that of your family, for the renown of your name extends throughout the land. Accordingly, you must understand that the treatment which you so keenly resent was in no sense intended as an insult. Therefore, banish your present gloomy mood, and dismiss all anger from your mind. For the festival which we solemnly celebrate with each returning year in honour of the god of laughter must always depend upon novelty for its success. And so our God, who owes you so great a debt today, decrees that his favouring presence shall follow you wherever you go, and that your cheerful countenance shall everywhere be a signal for hilarity. The whole city, out of gratitude, bestows upon you exceptional honours, enrolling your name as one of its patrons, and decreeing that your likeness in bronze shall be erected as a perpetual memory of today." End of section 25. Section 26 of Library of World's Best Mystery and Detective Stories, Volume 4. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Darvinia. Library of the World's Best Mystery and Detective Stories, Volume 4 by Julian Hawthorne, Editor. Section 26. Letter to Sura by Pliny the Younger. Our leisure furnishes me with the opportunity of learning from you, and you with that of instructing me. Accordingly, I particularly wish to know whether you think there exist such things as phantoms, possessing an appearance peculiar to themselves and a certain supernatural power, or that mere empty delusions receive a shape from our fears. For my part, I am led to believe in their existence, especially by what I hear happened to courteous Rufus. While still in humble circumstances and obscure, he was a hanger-on in the suite of the governor of Africa. While pacing the colonnade one afternoon, there appeared to him a female form of superhuman size and beauty. She informed the terrified man that she was Africa, and had come to foretell future events. For that he would go to Rome, would fill offices of state there, and would even return to that same province with the highest powers, and die in it. All which things were fulfilled. Moreover, as he touched at Carthage, and was disembarking from his ship, the same form is said to have presented itself to him on the shore. It is certain that, being seized with illness, and auguring the future from the past, and misfortune from his previous prosperity, he himself abandoned all hope of life, though none of those about him despaired. Is not the following story again still more appalling, and not less marvellous? I will relate it as it was received by me. There was at Athens a mansion, spacious and commodious, but of evil repute and dangerous to health. In the dead of night there was a noise as of iron, and, if you listened more closely, a clanking of chains was heard, first of all from a distance, and afterwards hard by. Presently a spectre used to appear, an ancient man sinking with emaciation and squalor, with a long beard and bristly hair, wearing shackles on his legs and fetters on his hands, and shaking them. Hence the inmates, by reason of their fears, passed miserable and horrible nights in sleeplessness. This want of sleep was followed by disease, and their terrors increasing, by death. For in the daytime as well, though the apparition had departed, yet a reminiscence of it flitted before their eyes, and their dread outlived its cause. The mansion was accordingly deserted, and condemned to solitude, was entirely abandoned to the dreadful ghost. However, it was advertised, on the chance of someone, ignorant of the fearful curse attached to it, being willing to buy or to rent it. Athenodorus, the philosopher, came to Athens and read the advertisement. When he had been informed of the terms, which were so low as to appear suspicious, he made inquiries, and learned the whole of the particulars. Yet none the less on that account, nay, all the more readily, did he rent the house. As evening began to draw on, he ordered a sofa to be set for himself in the front part of the house, and called for his notebooks, writing implements, and a light. The whole of his servants he dismissed to the interior apartments, and for himself applied his soul, eyes, and hand to composition, that his mind might not, from want of occupation, picture to itself the phantoms of which he had heard, or any empty terrors. At the commencement there was the universal silence of night. Soon the shaking of irons and the clanking of chains was heard, yet he never raised his eyes nor slackened his pen, but hardened his soul and deadened his ears by its help. The noise grew and approached. Now it seemed to be heard at the door, and next inside the door. He looked round, beheld, and recognized the figure he had been told of. It was standing and signaling to him with its finger, as though inviting him. He, in reply, made a sign with his hand that it should wait a moment, and applied himself afresh to his tablets and pen. Upon this, the figure kept rattling its chains over his head as he wrote. On looking round again, he saw it making the same signal as before, and without delay took up a light and followed it. It moved with a slow step, as though oppressed by its chains, and after turning into the courtyard of the house, vanished suddenly and left his company. On being thus left to himself, he marked the spot with some grass and leaves which he plucked. Next day he applied to the magistrates, and urged them to have the spot in question dug up. There were found there some bones attached to and intermingled with fetters. The body to which they had belonged, rotted away by time and the soil, had abandoned them thus naked and corroded to the chains. They were collected and interred at the public expense, and the house was ever afterwards free from the spirit which had obtained due sepulture. The above story I believe on the strength of those who affirm it. What follows I am myself in a position to affirm to others. I have a freedman who is not without some knowledge of letters. A younger brother of his was sleeping with him in the same bed. The latter dreamed he saw someone sitting on the couch, who approached a pair of scissors to his head, and even cut the hair from the crown of it. When day dawned, he was found to be cropped round the crown, and his locks were discovered lying about. A very short time afterwards, a fresh occurrence of the same kind confirmed the truth of the former one. A lad of mine was sleeping, in company with several others, in the page's apartment. There came through the windows, so he tells the story, 2 figures in white tunics, who cut his hair as he lay, and departed the way they came. In his case, too, daylight exhibited him shorn, and his locks scattered around. Nothing remarkable followed, except, perhaps, this, that I was not brought under accusation, as I should have been, if Domitian, in whose reign these events happened, had lived longer. For in his desk was found an information against me, which had been presented by Carus, from which circumstance it may be conjectured, inasmuch as it is the custom of accused persons to let their hair grow, that the cutting off of my slave's hair was a sign of the danger which threatened me being averted. I beg, then, that you will apply your great learning to this subject. The matter is one which deserves long and deep consideration on your part. Nor am I, for my part, undeserving of having the fruits of your wisdom imparted to me. You may even argue on both sides, as your way is, provided you argue more forcibly on one side than the other, so as not to dismiss me in suspense and anxiety, when the very cause of my consulting you has been to have my doubts put an end to. End of section 26. End of Library of the World's Best Mystery and Detective Stories, Volume 4, by Julian Hawthorne, Editor.